For the wives of the men who stood against Ivan the Terrible, death was a distant mercy, a final release that was systematically, cruelly, and deliberately denied. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here with me for this exploration. Let's find a quiet space, away from the noise of the world, to understand this difficult but essential part of our shared human story. In the frozen corridors of 16th century Russia, where breath crystallized before it left your lips, a particular kind of silence emerged. Not the silence of snow falling on monastery walls, not the hush of reverence in golden-domed cathedrals. This was the silence of women whose names had been erased, whose children had been torn away, whose very existence had been reduced to a single, terrible purpose: to suffer endlessly as living monuments to their husbands' destruction. The boyar wives knew what awaited them before the knock came at their door. They had seen it happen to others: the sudden arrival of black-robed riders, the reading of charges that meant nothing and everything, the methodical dismantling of a life that would continue beating long after meaning had been stripped away. Some tried to flee. Most understood there was nowhere to run in a land where Ivan's reach extended to every village, every forest clearing, every hidden cellar where a terrified family might seek refuge. What made Ivan's system so profoundly disturbing wasn't just its cruelty. History overflows with cruel rulers. It was the precision, the bureaucratic attention to detail in crafting fates specifically designed to be unbearable yet inescapable. Where other tyrants might execute entire families, Ivan understood something darker: that forcing someone to continue living after everything that made life worth living had been destroyed was a far more complete victory. The mechanics of this destruction followed patterns so consistent they might have been written in a manual. First came the public humiliation, accusations read in town squares while crowds were forced to watch. Then the confiscation of property, not just lands and gold but personal items, a mother's needlework, a child's wooden toy, wedding gifts that carried memories now poisoned forever. Finally, the journey to convents that served as prisons without bars, where women who had managed great households were reduced to shadows moving between mandatory prayers. These weren't simple imprisonments. Ivan's administrators had perfected a system that broke the human spirit through isolation, monotony, and the constant reminder of what had been lost. Letters were forbidden, visitors turned away. Even speaking of the past could bring punishment. The women were given new names, religious names, that erased their identities as surely as if they had died. Except they hadn't died. They continued, year after year, decade after decade, ghosts haunting their own existence. Consider Anna Koltovskaya, whose husband dared question one of Ivan's policies. She had managed estates, raised 6 children, and was known for her skill in managing complex trade negotiations. Within a month of her husband's execution, she found herself in a cell barely large enough to lie down in, renamed Sister Daria. Forbidden to mention her children's names, she would live another 30 years in that convent. 30 years of knowing her children grew up without her, married without her blessing, had grandchildren she would never hold. The ripple effects spread far beyond the women themselves. Children learned their mothers were dead even as those mothers lived and breathed miles away. Extended families were forbidden to help or even acknowledge the connection. Entire social networks built over generations collapsed overnight. The message was clear: oppose Ivan, and he wouldn't just destroy you. He would poison every relationship you had ever valued, turn every moment of joy in your life into a source of unending torment for those you loved most. This systematic cruelty served a calculated purpose. Every noble family in Russia had to weigh not just their own death, but the living death of everyone they cared about before even considering resistance. The mere existence of these broken women in their hidden convents cast a shadow across every court gathering, every political discussion, every moment when someone might have spoken truth to power but remembered what happened to those who tried. By the time Ivan's reign reached its peak of paranoia, hundreds of noble women had vanished into this parallel world of living death. Their stories were whispered in kitchens and stables, passed between servants who remembered the ladies they had served, kept alive by those who understood that forgetting would complete Ivan's victory. Yet even these whispers carried danger. To speak too openly of the vanished was to risk joining them. What haunts us most about this chapter of history isn't just the individual tragedies, though each one deserves to be remembered. It's the realization that one man's paranoid mind could create a system so perfectly calibrated to maximize human suffering while maintaining the pretense of mercy. After all, these women weren't executed. They were allowed to live, to pray, to contemplate their sins. That this was framed as clemency reveals depths of cruelty that challenge our understanding of power itself. The convents still stand today, some converted to museums, others maintaining their religious functions. Tourists walk through halls where women once paced endless circles, counting days that blurred into months that dissolved into years. The cells are empty now, their stone walls scrubbed clean. But if you know where to look, you can still find marks carved in hidden corners, initials, dates, sometimes just scratches that might have been someone's way of proving they still existed when everything else insisted they had already disappeared. As we stand at the threshold of this dark journey through Ivan's Russia, we must ask ourselves why this particular form of cruelty feels so profoundly disturbing. Perhaps because it reveals something essential about how power, when it becomes absolute, doesn't content itself with destroying bodies. It seeks to unmake souls, to reach backward through time and poison every happy memory, to extend forward and strangle every possible future. The wives who suffered under Ivan's system weren't just victims of one man's madness. They were casualties in humanity's ongoing struggle to understand what happens when power decides that death itself isn't punishment enough. Together, we'll explore what it meant for this cruelty to extend beyond the moment of execution, beyond even the lifetimes of its victims. This wasn't random violence or passionate rage. Ivan had discovered something that other tyrants throughout history would study and refine: the mathematics of suffering, calculated with the precision of an accountant tallying grain stores. The transformation from reformer to architect of living death didn't happen overnight. Young Ivan had once gathered scholars, built schools, established Russia's first printing press. He'd corresponded with Elizabeth I of England about trade and learning. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about a prince who seemed destined to pull Russia into the modern world. Something fundamental shifted in 1560, not gradually, but with the suddenness of ice cracking beneath your feet. The death of his first wife, Anastasia, shattered more than Ivan's heart. It broke his ability to trust in the possibility of natural death, natural loss, natural anything. From that moment forward, every death became suspicious, every illness a plot, every misfortune evidence of enemies working in shadow. The man who had built libraries now built lists, long, detailed catalogues of suspected traitors that grew with each passing month. Names added faster than they could be investigated, families implicated by association, entire bloodlines marked for destruction based on rumors, dreams, or simply being mentioned by someone else under torture. What emerged from this paranoid arithmetic was a new kind of state machinery, designed not for governance, but for the production of calculated misery. The Oprichnina, Ivan's personal army of black-robed enforcers, became laboratories where techniques of psychological destruction were tested, refined, perfected. They learned which convents had the harshest conditions, which abbesses could be trusted to enforce absolute isolation, which northern outposts were remote enough that screams wouldn't carry to nearby villages. The precision extended to documentation. Scribes recorded not just sentences but responses, noting which women wept, which went silent, which tried to bargain for their children's safety. These records, discovered centuries later in monastery archives, read like instruction manuals for breaking the human spirit. Marginal notes in different hands show administrators comparing techniques, sharing insights about which approaches produced the most complete destruction of hope. This bureaucratization of cruelty spread through the Russian state apparatus with terrible efficiency. Local governors learned to anticipate Ivan's desires, often moving against nobles' families before orders arrived from Moscow. The system fed itself, creating careers for those willing to perfect its methods, rewarding innovation in human suffering with lands and titles stripped from the condemned. The walls of the Kremlin remember the exact moment everything changed. March 15th, 60, late afternoon, when physicians emerged from the royal chambers with expressions that told Ivan everything he needed to know before they spoke. Anastasia Romanovna, his wife of 13 years, lay still beneath silk covers that couldn't hide how thin she had become. The woman who had softened his harsh edges, who had whispered reason when rage threatened to consume him, was gone. Ivan's scream shattered goblets 3 rooms away. Not grief alone, though grief was there, raw and primal. This sound carried something darker, the birth cry of absolute conviction that murder, not illness, had stolen his anchor to humanity. Within hours the transformation began. The young Tsar, who had spent mornings discussing law reforms, now paced his chambers, listing names. Every courtier who had served wine at recent feasts. Each doctor who had touched the Tsarina. Noble families whose smiles had seemed forced at court gatherings. By dawn, the list covered 3 pages in Ivan's cramped handwriting, ink still wet where his tears had fallen. His closest advisers watched this metamorphosis with growing alarm. Prince Andrei Kurbsky later wrote to a friend in Lithuania about those first days, how Ivan stopped sleeping, stopped eating regular meals, stopped tolerating any voice that suggested natural causes for Anastasia's death. The reformer king was dissolving like salt in water, leaving behind something crystalline and sharp. 7 weeks after the funeral, Ivan summoned his council for what they assumed would be discussions of succession and stability. Instead, they found their Tsar surrounded by stacks of denunciations, testimonies extracted from servants, astrological charts that proved the timing of Anastasia's illness aligned with enemy conspiracies. The paranoid architecture of the coming terror revealed itself in those documents, not random suspicion, but systematic categorization of threats, real and imagined. The council sat in silence as Ivan explained his new understanding. Russia was infested with traitors. They had killed his wife. They would kill his sons. They were probably poisoning him at that very moment. Only decisive action could save the dynasty, the faith, the nation itself. Some councillors nodded, whether from agreement or fear already taking root. Others exchanged glances that would later appear on lists of suspicious behavior. This shift from grief to grand conspiracy transformed the machinery of state with terrifying speed. Where Ivan had once appointed judges to codify laws, he now selected investigators to uncover plots. The same administrative precision that had organized Russia's first printing press turned toward cataloguing enemies. Scribes who had copied educational texts found themselves recording forced confessions. The most chilling aspect wasn't the paranoia itself, but its internal logic. Each investigation that failed to find concrete evidence of conspiracy proved how deeply hidden the conspiracy must be. Every noble who proclaimed innocence demonstrated their skill at deception. When torture produced contradictory testimonies, this only confirmed multiple plots operating simultaneously. The system justified itself through its own failures. By autumn, Ivan had identified the fundamental problem. Traditional punishment dealt only with individual traitors, but conspiracy was a disease that spread through bloodlines, marriages, friendships. To truly protect Russia, one had to destroy not just the infected, but everyone they might have contaminated. This meant wives, children, servants, entire households reduced to ash or worse, living witnesses to the price of suspected treason. The methodology developed with disturbing rationality. Execution created martyrs and ended suffering too quickly. Exile allowed regrouping and revenge. Prison required resources and created security risks. But there was another way, perfected over centuries by the Church for dealing with inconvenient women. The convent system, with slight modifications, could serve as a perfect mechanism for creating fates worse than death. Ivan's notebooks from this period, discovered centuries later in secret archives, reveal a mind applying mathematical precision to human destruction. He calculated how long various deprivations took to break different personality types, which combinations of isolation, hunger, and forced prayer produced the most complete psychological collapse. The optimal ages for separating mothers from children to maximize suffering for both. These weren't the ravings of a madman, but the careful calculations of someone engineering torment as deliberately as an architect designs a cathedral. The first noble wife to experience this new system was Maria Temryukova, whose husband had questioned Ivan's interpretation of a minor tax law. Her transformation from estate manager to Sister Agafia took 6 weeks. Watchers noted every stage: initial defiance, bargaining for her children's safety, the first cracks when she realized no amount of cooperation would reunite her family, the final surrender to endless days of forced prayer and forbidden memory. Word of Maria's fate spread through noble households like plague. Wives who had never concerned themselves with their husbands' political dealings suddenly became students of every gesture, every word that might draw Ivan's attention. The dinner conversations of Russian nobility shifted from art and trade to careful silence. Children learned to recognize the sound of approaching hooves that might herald their world's destruction. This fear reshaped Russian society from within. Noble families began sending wives and daughters to voluntary convent service, hoping preemptive religious dedication might spare them forced incarceration later. Others attempted to forge foreign connections, though Ivan's agents monitored every letter, every visitor from abroad. The paranoid fantasy of universal conspiracy was creating its own reality as desperate families actually did begin plotting escape. What distinguished Ivan's system from simple tyranny was its psychological sophistication. He understood that physical pain has limits, that death ends suffering, but that forcing someone to continue existing while everything meaningful has been stripped away creates a wound that never heals. The wives in their convent served as living reminders, to their families, to other nobles, to Ivan himself, that opposing the Tsar meant joining the ranks of the breathing dead. Metropolitan Philip, one of the few church leaders who dared criticize these methods, described visiting one of these convents in 1568. He found former ladies of the court mechanically copying religious texts, forbidden to speak of their past lives, their children, even their own names. When he tried to offer comfort, the abbess informed him that acknowledging their previous existence was considered a form of spiritual rebellion, punishable by reduced food rations and extended isolation. The efficiency of this cruelty required an entire infrastructure. Specific convents were designated for different categories of prisoners: wives of executed boyars in one, daughters of suspected conspirators in another. Abbesses were selected for their willingness to enforce absolute discipline. Regular inspections ensured no softness crept into the system. Reports flowed back to Moscow detailing each woman's deterioration, noting who still showed signs of hope that might require additional measures to extinguish. This bureaucracy of suffering attracted its own kind of servants. Men who discovered talent for psychological manipulation found careers in Ivan's service. They developed innovations, allowing glimpses of children during religious processions to reawaken maternal agony, intercepting and reading aloud letters from family members before burning them, permitting brief visits that ended just as emotional connections began reforming. Each refinement designed to prevent the numbness that might offer relief. The transformation was complete. The prince who had once gathered philosophers to debate the nature of justice now employed advisors who specialized in perfecting human misery. Where he had built schools to enlighten minds, he now constructed systems to shatter them. The reformer had become something history had rarely seen, an architect of suffering who approached his work with the dedication of a master craftsman. By 1565, the infrastructure was in place. The convents were prepared, the administrators trained, the noble families sufficiently terrorized to understand their position. All Ivan needed now was an instrument to implement his vision on the scale he imagined. The random cruelties of traditional tyranny wouldn't suffice. This required organization, dedication, men willing to pledge themselves entirely to their Tsar's dark vision. But a paranoid king is one thing. To enact a reign of terror, he needs an instrument. What kind of men would pledge themselves to such a cause? The Oprichnina. The word itself meant the part set aside. For Russia, it would become a decade-long nightmare that redefined the boundaries between governance and terror. On a December morning in 1564, Ivan vanished from Moscow. No announcement, no explanation. The Tsar simply loaded his treasury onto sleighs and disappeared into the winter darkness with his family and closest servants. Russia's nobles woke to find the throne empty, the palace corridors echoing with confusion. For 5 weeks, silence. Markets closed. Courts ceased functioning. Prayers in churches grew desperate. Then a messenger arrived, exhausted horse collapsing in the Kremlin courtyard, bearing 2 letters that would reshape the Russian state. The first letter, read aloud to assembled nobles, accused them of treason stretching back generations. Every military defeat, every diplomatic failure, every moment of Ivan's suffering traced back to boyar conspiracies. The Tsar declared himself too pure for such a corrupted realm and would remain in exile rather than rule over traitors. The second letter, addressed to Moscow's common people, promised Ivan's love and protection. Their suffering came not from their Tsar, but from the corrupt nobles who exploited them. If the people wanted their rightful ruler back, they knew who stood in the way. The calculated brilliance of this maneuver revealed itself within days. Crowds gathered outside noble homes. Merchants refused to trade with boyar households. The message spread through taverns and workshops. Bring back the Tsar, whatever the cost. When the desperate delegation of nobles and clergy finally reached Ivan at Alexandrova Sloboda, they found a transformed man. His hair had grown wild. His eyes held something that made grown warriors step backward. He agreed to return, but only under conditions that would have seemed like madness months earlier. Russia would be divided into 2 parts. The Zemshchina, the ordinary land, would continue under traditional administration, but vast territories, including parts of Moscow itself, would become the Oprichnina, Ivan's personal domain, where his word superseded all law, all tradition, all mercy. The geographical madness of this division defied logic. Streets split down the middle. Families found their homes on one side, their fields on the other. An invisible border, more absolute than any wall carved through the heart of Russia. Cross it without permission, and you simply vanished. In the Oprichnina territories, property rights ceased to exist. Noble families who had held lands for centuries received notices giving them days to relocate. No appeals, no compensation. Their estates became rewards for Ivan's new servants, men who understood that their prosperity depended entirely on their master's satisfaction. The first wave of deportations began in February 1565. Entire households loaded onto sledges in the depths of winter, children separated from family burial grounds, women forced to leave behind gardens tended for generations. The roads filled with noble refugees carrying what they could, heading for territories that might offer safety that no longer existed anywhere in Russia. Those who remained in the Zemshchina learned to navigate a world where invisible boundaries meant death. A merchant delivering goods might find his usual route now crossed Oprichnina territory. A priest visiting parishioners could vanish for entering the wrong district. Maps became useless when borders shifted according to Ivan's daily suspicions. The administrative machinery of division operated with terrifying precision. Special clerks maintained registers of every building, every field, every soul within Oprichnina boundaries. They tracked movements, recorded conversations, noted who showed insufficient enthusiasm for the new order. These records, cross-referenced and analyzed, created a surveillance state centuries before the technology that would make such control seem inevitable. Within Oprichnina territories, traditional law ceased to function. Local governors found their authority superseded by Ivan's personal representatives. Courts that had operated for centuries closed their doors. The complex legal codes Ivan himself had once reformed became meaningless paper in regions where the Tsar's morning mood determined justice. The psychological impact rippled outward from these divided territories. Families split by the border developed elaborate codes to communicate. Children learned to speak in metaphors that might slip past listeners. Love letters became exercises in saying nothing that could be interpreted as criticism. The Russian language itself adapted, developing layers of meaning that allowed survival in a world where words could kill. Moscow transformed into a schizophrenic city. In Zemshchina districts, life maintained a pretense of normalcy. Merchants traded, though carefully. Churches held services, though sermons avoided certain topics. In Oprichnina sections, black-robed figures moved through streets that emptied at their approach. The contrast visible from certain hilltops made the city look diseased, patches of normal life surrounded by zones of fear. The economic disruption followed inevitably. Trade routes that had functioned for centuries now required special passes. Craftsmen lost access to traditional suppliers. The great market squares that had made Moscow a commercial center fractured into segregated zones. Prices soared as goods became scarce, but complaining about economic hardship could be interpreted as criticizing the divine wisdom of the Tsar's design. Noble families caught in this division faced impossible choices: accept the loss of ancestral lands and hope for mercy, or resist and guarantee destruction. Most chose submission, watching estates their grandfathers had defended against Mongol invaders handed over to Ivan's new men. The few who protested discovered that in the Oprichnina, traditional nobility meant nothing. Ancient bloodlines offered no protection when Ivan's favor was the only currency that mattered. The borders themselves became weapons of psychological warfare. They shifted without warning. A family safe one day might wake to find their home now within Oprichnina territory. The uncertainty created a constant state of anxiety. Where would you flee if you couldn't know which direction led to safety? How could you plan for a future when the ground beneath your feet might belong to a different world tomorrow? The division served another purpose that revealed Ivan's strategic genius. By creating two Russias, he prevented unified opposition. Nobles in the Zemshchina couldn't coordinate with those in Oprichnina territories. Information flowed poorly across the divide. Resistance movements died in confusion as messages failed to cross boundaries that existed more in fear than physical reality. The church faced particular agony. Monasteries found themselves split, with some buildings in one zone and others across an invisible line. Priests had to choose between abandoning parishioners or risking themselves by crossing borders to provide sacraments. The unified spiritual authority that might have challenged Ivan's excesses fractured along the same lines that divided everything else. In taverns and markets, Russians developed a new vocabulary for their divided world. Going to grandmother's house meant crossing into Oprichnina territory. The weather changes past the church warned that borders had shifted again. My cousin moved south, indicated another family destroyed by the division. This coded language spread through all levels of society, a shadow tongue for a shadow state. The psychological brilliance lay in making everyone complicit. To function in this divided Russia required daily choices that acknowledged and reinforced the system. Every merchant who applied for a border pass, every noble who accepted relocation, every priest who altered his route to avoid Oprichnina zones participated in making the impossible division real. Children born after 1565 grew up in a world where this schizophrenia seemed natural. They learned from infancy which streets to avoid, which questions not to ask. The divided Russia became their only reality. When foreign visitors expressed amazement at cities split by invisible walls, these children couldn't understand the surprise. How else could a country function? The division extended beyond geography to time itself. In Oprichnina territories, feast days might be cancelled or mandated according to Ivan's visions. The calendar that had governed Russian life for centuries became another tool of control. Celebrating on the wrong day, failing to celebrate on demanded days, showed insufficient loyalty to the new order. Legal documents from this period reveal the bureaucratic insanity of maintaining two parallel systems. Marriage contracts had to specify which legal framework applied. Property transfers required different forms depending on the territory. Even death certificates changed based on which side of an invisible line a person died on. The multiplication of paperwork created its own industry of clerks and scribes who understood both systems. International trade, vital to Moscow's prosperity, nearly collapsed. Foreign merchants couldn't comprehend why their warehouses might be in one legal zone while their customers lived in another. The Hanseatic League, which had traded with Russia for centuries, sent delegations seeking clarification of rules that changed daily. Their confusion only deepened Ivan's conviction that foreign influence was part of the conspiracy against him. The small cruelties accumulated into systematic horror. A blacksmith split from his forge, a midwife forbidden to attend births across the border, children who played together one day, strangers the next, because their homes now existed in different worlds. Each individual tragedy seemed minor against the grand scope of division, but together they created a society where normal human connections became acts of dangerous rebellion. By 1566, the Oprichnina comprised nearly half of Russia's productive territory. Maps from this period, when they dared mark the divisions at all, looked like anatomical diagrams of a diseased organ. The healthy tissue of the Zemshina, surrounded by the spreading infection of territories where law meant nothing except Ivan's current obsession. The system fed on its own success. As Oprichnina expanded, more nobles lost their lands, creating more enemies who justified further expansion. The mathematical progression toward total control seemed inevitable. Some court observers predicted that within a decade, all of Russia would be Oprichnina, the division resolved by consuming everything that had once been normal. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their capitals about a kingdom that had voluntarily split its own skull. The English envoy wrote that negotiating with Russia now required understanding which version of the country you were addressing. The Polish ambassador noted that crossing from one zone to another felt like entering a different century, one where all the progress of civilization had been reversed. Yet the division's true genius lay not in the physical separation, but in what it allowed Ivan to create within Oprichnina boundaries. Here, freed from centuries of tradition and law, he could build something new. Something that would make the territorial divisions seem like mere preparation for a darker transformation. The infrastructure was in place, the kingdom divided, traditional authority shattered. Now Ivan needed only one more element to complete his vision. He needed men willing to become instruments of a terror so profound it would rewrite the meaning of loyalty itself. The soil of the Oprichnina had been prepared. Seeds of fear planted in every divided family, every split estate, every invisible border that turned neighbors into strangers. What grew from that poisoned earth would be unlike anything Russia or the world had witnessed. The Black Riders were coming, and with them, symbols that would haunt Russian nightmares for generations. A state needs enforcers. Who were the men who rode in the name of the Oprichnina, and what symbols did they carry? They rode in groups of 6 or 12, never alone. Black horses chosen for their height, black robes that absorbed light, black leather that creaked with each movement. The dogs' heads swinging from their saddles announced their purpose before they spoke. These were Ivan's hounds, come to sniff out treason. The broom attached beside it promised to sweep Russia clean. The first Oprichniki weren't noble sons or professional soldiers. Ivan selected them from unexpected places, minor provincial administrators who showed talent for cruelty, monastery servants who reported on their masters, foreign mercenaries with no local loyalties to complicate their work, young men from merchant families who understood that violence could purchase advancement impossible through traditional means. Malyuta Skuratov rose from managing a provincial warehouse to commanding terror across Russia. His ascent began with a single denunciation, a former employer accused of speaking against the Tsar's new policies. The thoroughness of Malyuta's testimony, the additional names he provided, the enthusiasm with which he participated in the subsequent interrogations, caught Ivan's attention. Within months, this son of minor townspeople commanded powers that ancient noble families had never dreamed of possessing. The recruitment process itself served as initiation into a new moral universe. Candidates presented themselves at Alexandrova Sloboda, Ivan's headquarters outside Moscow. They waited in barracks that had once housed monks, sleeping where holy men had prayed, transforming sacred space into something altogether different. Days passed without explanation. Some gave up and left, immediately marked as lacking sufficient dedication. Those who remained, learned patience, came before power. When summoned, each man faced questions that had no safe answers. Would you kill your father if the Tsar commanded it? Your brother? Your priest? The wrong hesitation ended hopes of advancement, but answering too quickly suggested dangerous ambition. Ivan and his inner circle had perfected the art of reading men's souls through their stammering responses to impossible questions. The oath ceremony took place in the palace chapel at midnight. Candidates knelt before an icon of the militant Christ, sword raised against enemies of the faith. They swore loyalty not to Russia, not to Orthodox Christianity, not to any principle beyond Ivan himself. The traditional bonds of family, friendship, and faith dissolved in words that made each man an extension of the Tsar's will. Former identities ceased to matter. They became simply Oprichniki, the set apart, the purified instruments of necessary terror. Their uniform carried meaning in every detail. The black robes evoked monks but perverted the symbolism. Where monks wore black in humility, the Oprichniki wore it as absorption of all light, all hope. The dog's head came from Psalms. Dogs have surrounded me, but transformed from metaphor to literal threat. The broom fulfilled prophecy, sweeping away the chaff to reveal the wheat, though in practice it swept away whoever even deemed chaff that morning. Training began immediately after the oath. Not traditional military exercises, though the Oprichniki learned to fight. Their education focused on psychological warfare, how to enter a household to maximum effect. The precise moment when hope turned to despair in a victim's eyes. Methods for making one family member betray another. The science of fear extracted from centuries of experience, refined into lessons taught by men who had mastered its application. They studied in the same rooms where Ivan had once gathered philosophers to debate justice. The irony wasn't lost on those who remembered the palace's earlier purpose. Where scholars had passed Greek texts on ethics, Oprichniki now learned optimal interrogation sequences. The library that housed theological treatises became an archive of denunciations, cross-referenced to track family connections that might require investigation. Physical conditioning mattered less than mental preparation. The Oprichniki needed to operate in a world where traditional morality inverted daily. Yesterday's ally became today's target based on whispers, dreams, or astrological calculations. They learned to suppress human responses that might interfere with duty, pity, friendship. Even basic recognition of shared humanity became weaknesses to overcome. The barracks at Alexandrova Sloboda fostered a brotherhood built on shared transgression. Men who had crossed lines they couldn't uncross found comfort only in the company of others who had done the same. They developed their own rituals, their own dark humor, their own ways of justifying what they did each day. The midnight drinking sessions where they competed with tales of effectiveness. The morning prayers that asked not for forgiveness but for strength to continue. Payment came in forms both material and psychological. Oprichniki received estates confiscated from their victims. They wore jewelry stripped from noble women before their convent exile. But the real compensation was power, the ability to make hereditary princes grovel, to enter any home, examine any document, question any person below the Tsar himself. For men born to bow before their betters, this reversal of hierarchy intoxicated more than wine. Their children attended special schools where they learned modified catechisms. God remained in heaven, but his representative on earth expressed his will through the Oprichnina. Traditional saints took second place to martyrs of the new order, Oprichniki, who died defending the Tsar from mostly imaginary conspiracies. These children grew up in a world where their father's midnight work seemed as natural as farming or trading. The 6,000 men who eventually joined the Oprichniki came from every corner of Russia and beyond. German mercenaries who had fought in religious wars brought professional expertise. Tatar horsemen contributed mobility and reputation for savagery. Polish renegades who couldn't return home added international connections. This diversity served Ivan's purpose, creating a force with no unified background except absolute dependence on his favor. They lived apart from normal society even when moving through it. Oprichniki couldn't marry without permission. Their wives, when allowed, came from similar backgrounds or from families seeking protection through alliance with terror. These marriages produced children who knew no world except one, where their father's work defined reality. Second-generation Oprichniki, raised from birth for service, proved even more effective than their parents at suppressing human feeling. The economic structure supporting them revealed Ivan's organizational genius. Each Oprichnik received basic salary plus percentages of confiscated property. The more treason they uncovered, the wealthier they became. This incentive system guaranteed enthusiasm. Empty accusations meant poverty. Successful investigations brought estates, gold, advancement. The mathematics of greed aligned perfectly with the mechanics of terror. Their presence transformed every space they entered. Markets fell silent when black robes appeared. Church services stumbled as priests forgot words under those watching eyes. Children learned to vanish at the sound of approaching hooves. The dog's head and broom became symbols that needed no explanation. Everyone understood their meaning at a visceral level that bypassed rational thought. The techniques they perfected would echo through centuries. The sudden night arrival that maximized disorientation. The reading of charges in language that sounded legal but meant nothing. The separation of family members to prevent collective resistance. The use of children as leverage against parents. The careful documentation that gave bureaucratic legitimacy to raw power. Each innovation built on the last, creating a system that operated with industrial efficiency decades before industrialization. Regional variations developed as Oprichniki adapted to local conditions. In Moscow, they operated with theatrical flair, public demonstrations of power. In remote provinces, they worked quietly, families simply vanishing without explanation. Coastal regions saw different tactics than inland areas. The system proved flexible enough to terrorize diverse populations while maintaining central control. The Oprichniki's own writings, preserved in monastery archives, reveal minds that had traveled far from normal human experience. They discussed their work in technical terms, comparing methods like craftsmen perfecting their trade. Emotional language disappeared from their correspondence, replaced by statistics and efficiency reports. Reading these documents feels like encountering an alien species that happens to share human form. Their victims left different records. Fragments of letters smuggled from convents, testimonies recorded by foreign merchants, children's drawings found centuries later in palace walls. These sources paint a portrait of men who had become something other than human in service to their master. The mechanical precision of their cruelty, the absence of hatred or passion in their work, the terrifying blankness in their eyes. Music played a strange role in their culture. The Oprichniki composed hymns that mixed sacred melodies with lyrics praising Ivan. They performed elaborate ceremonies that parodied religious services while celebrating their own brotherhood. Survivors described hearing these songs approaching in the night, voices raised in harmonies that would have been beautiful if not for the words and what they signified. The hierarchy within the Oprichniki reflected Ivan's paranoid brilliance. No clear command structure that might enable conspiracy. Instead, overlapping authorities and direct relationships with the Tsar that prevented any individual from accumulating too much power. They watched each other as carefully as they watched their victims. Denunciations within their own ranks kept everyone off balance, loyal only to Ivan who held all threads. By 1567, merely seeing an oprichnik could stop a man's heart. Physicians recorded cases of sudden death when black riders appeared at noble households. The physical impact of pure terror manifested in bodies that simply ceased functioning rather than endure what was coming. These deaths frustrated the Oprichniki, who lost opportunities to extract information and property from the dead. Foreign observers struggled to comprehend what they witnessed. The English ambassador wrote that the Oprichniki seemed like demons given flesh, but even that comparison failed to capture their bureaucratic efficiency. The Persian envoy noted that his own Shah employed executioners, but these were something different. Not mere killers, but architects of social destruction, operating according to careful plans. The transformation was complete. From scattered recruits to a brotherhood of 6,000. From men with ordinary human feelings to instruments of calculated terror. From servants of various masters to extensions of Ivan's paranoid will, they stood ready, dogs' heads swinging, brooms at hand, to remake Russia according to their master's darkest visions. With this terrifying force unleashed, how did Ivan begin to target his rivals? Did he start with the sword, or with a punishment designed to be a living death? For a noble woman of 16th century Russia, her identity was her name, her family, her place in society. What happens when all of that is taken? The black riders arrived at dawn. Their horses' breath steamed in the cold morning air as they dismounted outside the Volkonsky estate. Inside, Princess Marina Volkonskaya heard the sound she had dreaded for months. Heavy boots on stone steps, the jangle of keys that would open any door. Her husband had been executed 3 days ago. She knew what came next. The lead Oprichnik didn't knock. The door splintered inward, and 6 men in black robes entered her bedchamber. Marina stood in her nightclothes, chin raised, refusing to cower. The man who read the charges spoke in a monotone that suggested he'd delivered these words countless times before. Treason by association, corruption of bloodline, spiritual contamination requiring immediate purification. Her children woke to find their mother being dressed by servants whose hands shook. 6-year-old Katya reached for Marina's skirts, but an Oprichnik stepped between them. The message was clear, that bond no longer existed. Marina Volkonskaya, wife of a traitor, mother of contaminated offspring, was already becoming something else. The journey to the intercession convent took 2 days through February storms. Marina rode in a covered sledge, forbidden to look back at the estate where she'd given birth, managed harvests, hosted gatherings that shaped regional politics. The Oprichniki surrounded her transport, their black forms moving through white snow like ink blots spreading across parchment. At village crossroads, peasants dropped to their knees, not in respect, but in the hope that stillness might make them invisible. The convent walls rose from the frozen landscape like a tomb prepared for the living. Marina had visited such places before, bringing donations, attending feast day celebrations. This arrival was different. No bells rang, no sisters emerged to greet a noble visitor. Only the abbess waited in the courtyard, her face carved from years of enforcing isolation on women who had once commanded estates. The transformation began immediately. Marina's silk robes, still warm with her body heat, were stripped away. The jewels that marked her rank, wedding gifts, family heirlooms, pieces that carried stories across generations, vanished into a wooden box she would never see again. Her hair, still scented with imported oils, fell in dark waves as the abbess wielded the shears. Each cut severed another connection to the woman she had been. The rough wool habit scraped against skin accustomed to finest linens. It smelled of other bodies, other women who had worn it before disappearing into whatever fate awaited those who entered but never left. Marina's feet, soft from years of proper footwear, bled within hours from the crude sandals, but physical discomfort paled beside what came next. "You are Sister Agatha now," the abbess announced. The name meant nothing, chosen from a list of acceptable religious designations. Marina Volkonskaya, who could trace her ancestry to the founding of Moscow, ceased to exist. In her place stood a woman with no past, no future, no identity beyond the walls that now contained her. The cell measured 6 paces by 4. A straw pallet, a wooden cross, a bucket, stone walls that wept moisture, even in winter's depth. The narrow window, placed too high to reach, showed only sky. Marina, Sister Agatha, tried to calculate how many dawns she might watch through that opening. The mathematics of a lifetime suddenly compressed into this space made her knees buckle. The daily routine operated with mechanical precision. Prayers before dawn, breakfast of black bread and water. Hours copying religious texts in a scriptorium where conversation brought punishment. More prayers. Dinner identical to breakfast. Evening services. Then the return to cells where women who had managed complex households lay on straw, counting breaths in the darkness. The other inmates moved like ghosts through their prescribed activities. Marina recognized some faces. The wife of a boyar executed last autumn, the daughter of a merchant who'd questioned new taxes, women whose names had once opened doors across Russia. Now they passed without acknowledgement, each trapped in the solitary confinement of their own erased existence. The rules multiplied daily. No speaking of the past, no mentioning children, husbands, homes that existed beyond these walls. No letters in or out. No visitors except the confessor who came monthly to hear admissions of sins that grew more imaginary with each session. Even dreams became dangerous when morning interrogations demanded accounts of nighttime thoughts. Sister Catherine had been there longest, 5 years that showed in her hollow cheeks and empty eyes. She'd been Countess Ekaterina Sheremeteva, mother of 3 sons, manager of estates that fed half of Novgorod. During Marina's 3rd week, Catherine broke. The screaming started at matins and continued through the morning psalms. She shouted her children's names, her husband's name, her own forbidden name, until her voice cracked and blood flecked her lips. The punishment was solitary confinement in the basement cells. When Catherine emerged a month later, she no longer spoke at all. She moved through the daily patterns, prayer, work, prayer, sleep, but something essential had departed. Marina watched this woman who had once negotiated trade agreements with Hanseatic merchants and understood she was seeing her own future. The cruelest moments came unexpectedly. A feast day procession passed the convent walls, and through the singing, Marina heard a child's laughter that sounded exactly like her Katya. The smell of baking bread from the kitchens triggered memories of supervising holiday preparations. A particular quality of afternoon light recalled evenings when her husband would return from court, and they would walk together in their gardens discussing the day's events. These ambushes of memory left her gasping. The abbess watched for such moments, noting which women still showed signs of attachment to their former lives. Additional prayers were assigned, food rations reduced. The message was clear: forget faster or suffer more. Some women tried to resist through small acts of rebellion. Secret names whispered in the darkness, flowers picked during garden work and hidden in cells, fragments of secular songs hummed under breath. But the system ground down such defiance with patient efficiency. The woman who whispered names found herself in solitary. The flowers brought interrogation about correspondence with the outside. The songs earned a week of enforced silence. Marina learned to perform emptiness. She moved through prayers without letting her lips form her children's names. She copied texts without seeing her daughter's face in the illuminated letters. She ate tasteless bread without remembering harvest feasts. The performance became reality by degrees. Each day another step toward the void the abbess demanded. The physical changes marked time more accurately than any calendar. Soft hands grew calloused from scrubbing stones. Hair, once Marina's pride, grew back grey and coarse beneath the veil. Bodies shaped by childbearing and comfortable living transformed into angular frames that seemed to occupy less space, as if they were gradually disappearing. News from outside came in fragments. A new sister arrived with whispered updates, overheard conversations between guards, changes in prayer requests that suggested political shifts. Marina learned her eldest son had been sent to serve in a frontier regiment. Her daughter had been placed with a merchant family. Her youngest boy, she forced her mind away from that path. Such knowledge served only to deepen wounds that would never heal. The confession sessions operated as psychological warfare. The priest, selected for his ability to find sin in sanctity, demanded detailed accounts of thoughts, dreams, momentary lapses in dedication. Marina learned to manufacture appropriate transgressions, as pride in completing copying assignments, gluttony for wanting more bread, sloth for sleeping too deeply. Real sins, the rage that threatened to consume her, the fantasies of revenge, the moments when she considered whether the kitchen knives were sharp enough to end this existence, remained unspoken. Some women found refuge in genuine religious feeling. They embraced their new identities, convinced themselves that suffering served divine purpose. Marina envied them even as she recognized this as another form of death. To truly become Sister Agatha meant accepting that Marina Volkonskaya deserved erasure, that her children were better without her, that Ivan's justice reflected God's will. That transformation seemed worse than the physical confinement. The seasons cycled outside the walls. Marina marked 2 years by the patterns of ice on stone, the quality of light through her cell window, the changes in prayers for harvest or protection from winter. 2 years of existence that wasn't life, of breathing that wasn't living, of continuation that served only to demonstrate the completeness of her destruction. Then came the morning when a new arrival brought transformation. Not another noble wife condemned to living death, but news that created the first crack in the system's perfect cruelty. The woman whispered updates as they worked in the garden, her words carrying impossible hope. Changes in Moscow. Ivan's attention turned elsewhere. Some convents receiving new directives. Marina, Sister Agatha, forced herself not to react. Hope was another cruelty in this place, perhaps the cruelest of all. But something shifted in the atmosphere. The abbess seemed distracted. Guards spoke in hushed tones. The rigid patterns that had defined 2 years of erasure showed signs of strain. That night, Marina lay on her pallet and allowed herself a dangerous thought. She shaped her daughter's name silently, feeling the forbidden syllables form in her mind. Katya. The word was a key that unlocked a flood of memories she'd spent 2 years suppressing. her daughter's weight as a newborn, first words, the solemn expression when attempting new tasks. All of it rushed back, beautiful and agonizing. The morning bell rang as it had more than 700 times before. Marina rose, dressed in the rough habit, prepared for another day of performed emptiness. But beneath the routine, something had changed. Not hope exactly. Hope was too dangerous. Rather, a crack in the wall of despair that had seemed absolute. A fissure that suggested walls, no matter how solid, might not stand forever. She joined the processional to morning prayers, moving with the mechanical precision the abbess demanded. Around her, other ghosts of women performed the same empty rituals, but Marina noticed small differences. A straightening of shoulders here, a direct glance there, tiny rebellions that suggested others had heard the whispers, felt the shift, begun to remember they had once been human. The abbess noticed too. Her voice carried new harshness as she led prayers. Her eyes swept the assembled women with fresh suspicion. The system that had operated with such efficient cruelty for years suddenly seemed fragile, dependent on the broken spirits of its victims. What would happen if those spirits began to mend? If the women remembered they outnumbered their guards? If Sister Agatha became Marina Volkonskaya again? Such questions were dangerous. Marina pushed them down, focused on the words of the psalm, but they lingered like smoke from a fire not quite extinguished. She had survived 2 years of living death. She could survive whatever came next. And perhaps, in surviving, she might discover whether resurrection was possible for those buried alive. The prayers ended. The women filed toward the scriptorium for another day of copying texts that erased their own existence. Marina took her place, picked up her pen, began forming letters with hands that remembered other writing, letters to her children, instructions to estate managers, documents that shaped the world beyond these walls. Those hands were still hers, whatever name the abbess imposed. That knowledge, small as a seed, planted itself in the wasteland of her spirit. Outside, wind-rattled windows that had witnessed too much suffering. Inside, women who had been condemned to living death continued breathing, continued hoping despite themselves, continued existing in defiance of those who sought their erasure. The convent walls stood strong. But walls, Marina was beginning to remember, were built by human hands. And human hands could tear them down. But what about the women who weren't sent to convents? What happened to the world they left behind? The estate records tell their own story of systematic destruction, where detailed household accounts once tracked harvests and trade negotiations. Blank pages mark the moment when everything changed. The transformation from prosperity to destitution happened not over years but in the span of a single afternoon. Anna Chelyadnina discovered her new reality through her children's tears. Her husband's arrest 3 days earlier had left the household in suspended terror, servants tiptoeing through halls that felt suddenly foreign. She maintained the routines, supervised the kitchens, reviewed accounts, as if normalcy might protect them from what everyone knew was coming. The children sensed the change in how merchants looked away when she entered their shops, how neighbors crossed streets to avoid greeting her. The Oprichniki didn't need to break down doors this time. They walked through the main entrance as if they owned it, which legally they now did. Anna stood in the great hall where she had welcomed guests for 15 years, watching strangers inventory her life. The lead official read from a scroll that transformed her from estate owner to trespasser in the space of 3 sentences. Her lady's maid tried to pack clothing, but the Oprichnik shook his head. Nothing belonged to them anymore. Not the wedding dress stored in cedar chests, not the children's toys carved by their father, not even the account books where Anna had recorded every detail of managing 3 estates and 200 souls. The servants vanished like smoke. Some slipped away during the night before the official arrival, survival instincts honed by generations of political upheaval. Others simply turned their faces when Anna called their names, allegiance shifting with the brutal mathematics of self-preservation. The wet nurse who had raised Anna's youngest son now served the Oprichnik commander, offering him wine from cellars Anna's family had stocked for decades. Within hours, the transformation was complete. The woman who had negotiated grain prices that fed half the district now stood in the courtyard with 3 children and the clothes on their backs. No carriage waited. No destination was offered. The message was clear in its silence. cease to exist, beginning now. The youngest boy, barely 4, kept asking when they would go home. Anna's daughter, old enough at 12 to understand their situation, pressed her lips together and took his hand. The eldest son, 14 and burning with rage that had nowhere to go, stood rigid as stone while their world dissolved around them. They walked through gates Anna had passed through thousands of times, into a world that no longer recognized them. The road stretched toward Moscow, muddy from spring thaw. Other travelers passed without acknowledgement. A merchant family Anna had hosted countless times looked through her as if she were air. The social death preceded any physical ending by design. Finding shelter that first night taught lessons no noblewoman should learn. The inn, where Anna had stayed during travels to court, suddenly had no rooms. The monastery that received generous donations from her family claimed full occupancy despite visible empty cells. Finally, a peasant woman, recognizing desperation that transcended class, offered her barn. The children slept on straw that smelled of animals, exhaustion overwhelming their bodies. Anna sat awake, calculating survival with skills meant for managing estates. No money, jewelry sewn into hems had been discovered and confiscated, family connections now poisoned to anyone who acknowledged them. The arithmetic led nowhere except deeper into impossibility. Morning brought new humiliations. Anna approached the market stallholders she had traded with for years. Some pretended not to understand her requests for credit. Others explicitly stated the danger of associating with traitor families. One woman, braver or more foolish than the rest, slipped her a loaf of day-old bread when no one was watching. That small kindness cut deeper than cruelty. The children learned hunger as she had never imagined them knowing it. Not the brief appetite before meals, but the gnawing emptiness that shaped every thought. Her daughter stopped complaining first, recognizing the futility. The boys held out longer before accepting that mother could no longer provide what they needed. Work existed for those willing to take it, but not for the wife of an executed traitor. Anna tried everything, sewing for merchants who had once commissioned elaborate garments from her, tutoring children in languages she spoke fluently, offering accounting services to traders who desperately needed such skills. Each rejection came with the same unspoken message: you are contaminated, and contact means death. The descent happened in stages. First, trading the last hidden ring for food that lasted 3 days. Then accepting charity from increasingly dangerous sources. Finally, the morning Anna found herself considering which child could best survive without her, calculating the mathematics of one less mouth to feed. Other women shared this shadow existence. Moscow's streets held dozens of former nobles reduced to begging, their children growing feral from neglect born of impossibility. They recognized each other through subtle signals, shared glances that acknowledged their common fall. But recognition brought no community. Associating with other traitor families doubled the danger. Anna watched her daughter's hands grow rough from the labor they finally found, washing clothes in icy rivers for kopecks that barely bought bread. Those hands had been trained for needlework, for managing household accounts, for the gentle arts of nobility. Now they bled from lye and cold water, aged decades in months. The boys found their own solutions. The eldest disappeared for days, returning with food and haunted eyes that suggested its source. The youngest learned to slip through market crowds, small fingers finding what they needed in unguarded moments. Anna knew she should stop them, but maternal ethics collapsed before the reality of starvation. Winter arrived like a predator. The barn that had sheltered them was no longer available, its owner fearing association. Urban doorways and bridge underpasses became home, shared with others who had fallen from different heights. Anna learned to identify which beggars had been merchants, which priests, which minor nobles caught in Ivan's expanding web of paranoia. Disease followed cold. The youngest boy developed a cough that rattled his thin chest. No physician would treat the child of a traitor. The herbs Anna knew could help required money they didn't have. She watched her son burn with fever, calculating whether stealing medicine would bring quicker death than letting illness take its course. The letter came through channels so convoluted Anna never learned its path. Her sister, married into a family that had so far escaped Ivan's attention, offered sanctuary for one child. Only one. The choice that followed broke something in Anna that had survived everything else. She sent her daughter, the one with the best chance of remembering and recovering their family's dignity someday. The boys understood without explanation. The eldest held his youngest brother while Anna walked their sister to the designated meeting place. They never spoke of it afterward, but the family of 5 had become 3, and the mathematics of survival shifted slightly toward possible. Spring brought different challenges. The boys had grown during winter, childhood burning away in the crucible of street survival. They no longer asked about home or when father would return. Their education now consisted of identifying which merchants threw away edible scraps, which churches offered bread without demanding impossible documentation, which alleys provided safety from both criminals and authorities. Anna caught her reflection in a shop window and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Hollow cheeks, prematurely grey hair, hands that had wielded accounting quills now gnarled from manual labor. But the eyes remained hers, still calculating, still fighting for her children's survival against odds that mounted daily. The state's cruelty lay not just in creating these conditions but in maintaining them indefinitely. No path back existed. No amount of virtue or hard work could overcome the taint of association with treason. The system designed itself to be inescapable, generational, a curse passed from parent to child until bloodlines simply ended. Other former nobles found different solutions. Some women sold themselves to brothels that specialized in fallen nobility, where clients paid extra to debase someone who had once stood above them. Others simply walked into the Moscow River on winter nights, choosing the river's embrace over another day of degradation. Anna understood both choices with terrifying clarity. The market square, where she had once purchased imported silks, now served as the stage for their daily humiliation. Merchants who had competed for her patronage watched her beg for scraps. Former servants passed without acknowledgement. The architecture of social death surrounded them more completely than any prison walls. Yet survival continued, stripped to its most basic elements. Food for today, shelter from tonight's cold, protection from those who would prey on the vulnerable. Everything else, every memory of comfort or dignity or hope for the future, became luxury too expensive to maintain. The boys adapted with the plasticity of youth. They learned new languages, the argot of street children and dock workers. Their noble accents faded, replaced by the rough tones of survival. Anna watched this transformation with mixed grief and gratitude. Their noble birth had become liability, perhaps forgetting it offered the only escape. Documents from this period, preserved by foreign merchants who recorded what Russian sources feared to mention, catalogue hundreds of such families. The wives and children of executed nobles dissolved into Moscow's streets like sugar in rain. Some survived through adaptations that would have horrified their former selves. Most simply vanished, their endings unrecorded except as statistics in reports about urban death rates. Anna Chelyadnina's story continues in those merchant records for another 2 years. Then nothing. Whether death, exile, or some other fate claimed her remains unknown. Her children disappear from history entirely, absorbed into the anonymous mass of Ivan's collateral damage. The system achieved its purpose with mathematical precision. For every noble who might have opposed Ivan, dozens of family members served as hostages to fortune. The women especially, raised for lives of management and culture, found themselves least equipped for the brutal realities of destitution. Their suffering sent messages more effectively than any execution. The cruelest aspect wasn't the poverty itself, but its public nature. These women couldn't retreat to rural obscurity. They remained in Moscow, visible reminders of the price of opposing the Tsar. Every noble wife who passed them in the street saw her own potential future. Every husband who witnessed their degradation understood what awaited his family should he step wrongly. Some tried to help despite the danger. Anonymous packages of food appeared occasionally, a warm cloak left where a desperate mother would find it. Small acts of humanity that risked everything for the donors. But systematic charity was impossible when helping traitor families constituted treason itself. The children who survived this systematic destruction carried scars that shaped Russia's future. Boys who learned to steal bread at 6 became men who understood survival required absolute ruthlessness. Girls who watched their mothers beg developed either unbreakable hardness or consuming fear of authority. An entire generation grew up understanding that family, loyalty, and love meant nothing before state power. This was Ivan's true genius. More terrifying than any torture chamber, he created a system where the state's enemies punished themselves through their own continued existence, where love became weapon turned against those who felt it, where the natural bonds between parent and child transformed into instruments of mutual torment. The foreign observers who recorded these scenes struggled to convey their full horror to distant audiences. How could comfortable Europeans understand a system that weaponized maternal love, that turned children's hunger into state policy, that maintained careful balance where victims remained barely alive, suffering visibly enough to serve as warnings but not dying quickly enough to escape their role as object lessons? By 1568, Moscow contained hundreds of such broken families. They moved through the streets like a parallel population, visible yet unacknowledged, present yet erased. Their existence poisoned every noble celebration, every merchant feast, every moment of comfort enjoyed by those who had so far escaped Ivan's attention. The temporary nature of that escape was the final cruelty. Everyone knew their turn might come tomorrow. A misinterpreted word, a rival's whispered accusation, a dream Ivan considered prophetic could transform Duchess to beggar overnight. This shared vulnerability created a society where no one dared offer substantial help, where former friends became strangers the moment accusation touched a family. The women who endured this living death left few records of their own thoughts. Literacy meant nothing when paper was luxury and writing materials impossible to obtain. Their stories survive only in fragments, glimpses caught by foreign observers, court records that note their husbands' executions and then silence. But their impact shaped Russian society for generations. Every noble child grew up knowing these shadow figures existed. Every wife understood that her husband's political choices could reduce her to begging within days. Every family celebration carried the unspoken knowledge that all of this could vanish between one breath and the next. The convents at least offered walls and routine. The streets provided neither shelter nor structure, only the daily struggle to exist while serving as living warnings to others. These women, stripped of everything that defined their humanity except breath itself, became Ivan's most effective instruments of terror, not through anything they did, but simply by continuing to exist in states that made death seem merciful. Their suffering posed questions that echo through centuries. What does it mean to survive when survival itself becomes torment? How does a mother choose between her children when society makes feeding all of them impossible? When does the human spirit finally break, and what remains afterward? Ivan the Terrible understood something that would inspire future tyrants. Death ends suffering and creates martyrs. But living death continues indefinitely, regenerating fear with every witnessed humiliation, every child's hungry cry, every former noblewoman begging for bread in the square where she once purchased silk. This was his gift to history, a methodology of cruelty that recognized the family as the perfect instrument for multiplying individual suffering into social control. The streets of Moscow became his gallery, displaying broken women and starving children like artworks, demonstrating the price of resistance. And it worked. It worked with horrible efficiency that would echo through Russian history, teaching future autocrats that the family could be weaponized, that love could be turned into liability, that mercy properly calibrated was crueler than any torture. This deliberate destruction of hundreds of noble families was devastating, but it was only the beginning. The winter of 1568 brought a new kind of terror to Moscow. Black riders moved through noble districts with lists that grew longer each night. Behind closed doors, wives felt their husbands' bodies tense at every sound from the street. Children learned to read danger in their parents' silences. The Oprichniki had discovered that broken families served their purposes better than executed men ever could. Alexei Basmanov understood this mathematics of fear with particular clarity. Ivan's closest advisor had risen from minor nobility to commanding the instruments of terror precisely because he grasped what others missed. Bodies hanging in the square made statements that lasted days. Wives and daughters transformed into living ghosts haunted society for decades. The methodology evolved through careful experimentation. First came the theatrical arrests, timed for maximum witness, then the public executions that served as overture to deeper horrors. Finally, the systematic attention to families that transformed personal tragedy into social control, each refinement calculated to extract maximum suffering from minimum effort. Maria Morozova watched her husband's execution from a window they forced her to stand before. The Oprichniki held her children beside her, ensuring they witnessed their father's final moments. The eldest boy's scream when the axe fell would echo through their house for years. But that sound was prologue to what followed. The lead Oprichnik turned from the scaffold to face Maria directly. His words carried the flat tone of someone reading a grocery list. Her husband's treason had contaminated the household. Purification required special measures. The men who entered her home that night came not as executioners but as something worse. They moved through rooms with the efficiency of locusts. Every surface that might hide valuables was torn open. Furniture that had furnished the house for generations became kindling. The library where her husband had taught their sons to read burned in the courtyard while neighbors watched from behind curtains. But property destruction was mere punctuation to the main text. The Oprichniki had learned that noble wives possessed two forms of treasure more valuable than gold: their bodies and their children. The systematic violation that followed operated according to protocols refined through repetition, not random brutality but calculated destruction of every source of identity and dignity. Young Katya Morozova hid in the root cellar when the sounds from her mother's chamber became unbearable. She pressed her palms against her ears but couldn't block out the methodical nature of what was happening above. Hour after hour, while her brothers huddled beside her in the darkness, the men took turns with the patience of workers completing an assigned task. The physical violence served a specific purpose beyond immediate degradation. A defiled wife couldn't return to noble society even if political winds shifted. Her pollution became permanent, inherited by children who would carry the stain through generations. The Oprichniki understood that some wounds never healed, and they specialized in creating exactly those injuries. When morning came, Maria lay on torn sheets that had been her wedding linens. The men filed out as professionally as they'd entered, discussing the weather while stepping over the unconscious forms of servants who'd tried to intervene. The house stood open to winter wind through doors they hadn't bothered to close. Neighbors who might have helped stayed hidden, knowing assistance meant joining the victim list. The children emerged from hiding to find their mother transformed. Not dead, but something that made death seem merciful by comparison. She didn't speak when they approached. Her eyes focused on something beyond the walls, beyond Moscow, beyond any place her children could follow. The boys tried to cover her with blankets while Katya attempted to clean wounds that went deeper than flesh. This scene repeated across Moscow with variations that revealed the Oprichniki's attention to psychological detail. Some wives were violated in front of their children to maximize traumatic witness. Others were taken to black sites where imagination magnified suffering through uncertainty. The methodology adapted to what would break each family most completely. Official reports from this period, written in the bureaucratic language that transformed atrocity into administrative procedure, catalogue the efficiency: household neutralized, contamination contained, female elements processed according to established protocols. The words create distance from acts that destroyed human souls as methodically as grinding grain to flour. Foreign ambassadors confined their observations to private correspondence, knowing official protests would only expand the victim list. The English envoy wrote of noble ladies who walked through Moscow streets like animated corpses. The Polish ambassador noted that Russian noblewomen had taken to traveling in groups, as if collective presence might offer protection from state-sanctioned predation. The targeting revealed careful selection. Wives of executed traitors received immediate attention, but the system also reached those whose husbands lived under suspicion, creating anticipatory terror that shaped behavior more effectively than retroactive punishment. Every noble family understood that female members had become hostages to political compliance. Some women attempted preemptive measures. Lady Yelena Shuyskaya sent her daughters to a distant convent before her husband's arrest, hoping religious walls might offer protection. The Oprichniki found them anyway. The violation of nuns added sacrilege to atrocity, demonstrating that no sanctuary existed from Ivan's reach. The Church's silence in response taught its own lesson about institutional power. The perpetrators themselves revealed the system's effect on those who operated it. Initially, the Oprichniki showed signs of human hesitation. Early reports mention men who required vodka before certain assignments, but repetition eroded whatever conscience they'd possessed. By 1568, veterans discussed techniques for breaking different types of women with the dispassion of craftsmen comparing tools. Their own families occupied a strange space in this ecosystem of violence. Oprichniki wives knew what their husbands did, but were forbidden to acknowledge it. Their children grew up in households where father's work remained unmentionable, despite shaping every aspect of their lives. Some Oprichniki daughters later testified about nightmares filled with sounds they'd heard through walls, understanding without explanation what those sounds meant. The economic dimension added another layer of calculated cruelty. Violated women lost all property rights under laws that considered them polluted. Their dowries reverted to the state. Their children's inheritance vanished into Oprichnik coffers. The system funded itself through the destruction of those it targeted, creating financial incentives for thoroughness. Medical practitioners of the era left fragmentary records of treating these victims, wounds that suggested systematic methodology rather than spontaneous violence. Injuries calibrated to cause maximum pain while ensuring survival. The physicians noted patterns that indicated training, perhaps even manuals that codified optimal approaches to breaking human bodies without killing them. The psychological sophistication extended to timing. The Oprichniki learned to space their visits, allowing partial recovery before returning. Hope became another weapon as women who thought the worst had passed discovered new depths of suffering. The irregularity itself generated constant anxiety that prevented any psychological healing between assaults. Children who witnessed these systematic violations carried specific types of damage into adulthood. Boys learned that masculinity meant either perpetrating such violence or failing to prevent it. Girls understood their future vulnerability with clarity that shaped every subsequent relationship. Entire generations grew up comprehending that family bonds created liability rather than protection. The noble families who escaped direct attention still lived under this shadow. Every father understood his political choices could trigger his wife's violation. Every mother knew her body had become a potential battlefield in conflicts she didn't create. Marriage itself transformed from sacrament to source of danger that multiplied with each child born into uncertain times. Some women found ways to resist that history barely records. Poison hidden in jewelry took several Oprichniki during what they assumed would be routine violations. One Moscow widow managed to kill 3 attackers before the 4th ended her resistance. These fragments suggest broader patterns of defiance that official records naturally omitted. The convents that had once offered spiritual refuge became overwhelmed with women seeking preemptive sanctuary. But voluntary religious commitment provided little protection when Oprichniki arrived with official warrants. The abbesses faced impossible choices between defending their charges and preserving their institutions. Most chose institutional survival, opening doors to men who transformed holy spaces into sites of systematic horror. International observers struggled to convey these realities to distant courts that could barely comprehend such systematic use of sexual violence as state policy. The Venetian ambassador wrote coded letters describing unspeakable acts that his government initially dismissed as exaggeration. Only when multiple sources confirmed the same patterns did foreign powers begin to understand what Ivan had unleashed. The impact rippled far beyond immediate victims. Servants who witnessed attacks on their mistresses suffered their own trauma. Children raised by violated mothers grew up in households where unspoken horror poisoned every interaction. Extended families found themselves tainted by association with pollution that laws enshrined as permanent. By late 1568, the mere sight of Oprichniki approaching a noble house could trigger suicide attempts. Women who had spent years building families and managing estates chose death over what they knew awaited them. The system had achieved its purpose, creating fear so profound that it preceded actual violence, multiplying its effect through anticipation. The documentation of this period remains fragmentary precisely because those who might have recorded it were either victims, perpetrators, or terrified bystanders. What survives suggests systematic horror that operated for years with bureaucratic efficiency. Each violated woman became a message written in suffering, read by every family that still retained wealth or position. The transformation of rape from a war crime to an administrative tool marked something new in governance. Previous rulers had allowed soldiers to assault conquered populations, but Ivan created a system where sexual violence became a calibrated instrument of political control, documented and refined like any other state function. This infrastructure of assault required its own logistics: safe houses where prominent women could be taken, medical personnel to ensure victims survived for continued utility, administrators who tracked which families had been processed and which awaited attention. The banality of these arrangements somehow deepened the horror. The men who performed these acts left few personal records, but their collective impact shaped Russian society's understanding of power. They demonstrated that authority meant not just the ability to kill, but to violate, to pollute, to transform human beings into warnings written in flesh and trauma. Every noble family that survived this period did so marked by the knowledge of what could have been done to them. Resistance took forms that official histories ignore. Women's networks developed codes for warning each other of Oprichniki movements. Some families managed to smuggle daughters out of Russia entirely, accepting permanent exile as preferable to likely violation. These fragments of agency persisted despite overwhelming state power. The foreign merchants who maintained Moscow compounds during this period describe a city transformed by gendered terror. Noble ladies who had once moved freely through public spaces now travelled in closed carriages with armed escorts. Social gatherings segregated by sex as families tried to minimize vulnerability. The elaborate court ceremonies that had showcased Russian nobility's sophistication became tense affairs where women's presence carried new dangers. Physical architecture adapted to these realities. Noble houses added fortified women's quarters. Secret passages connected bedrooms to hiding places. Windows designed for quick escape rather than light. The buildings themselves testified to a society where state-sanctioned sexual violence had become so normalized that construction practices evolved to acknowledge it. The children raised in this environment developed particular survival strategies. Daughters learned to make themselves invisible, to avoid notice that might mark them for attention. Sons grew up understanding that protecting female relatives was simultaneously paramount duty and likely impossibility. Family dynamics warped around the gravitational pull of potential violence. Religious authorities faced their own crisis. Orthodox Christianity emphasized female purity, but the church proved powerless to protect it. Priests, who should have offered sanctuary instead, performed last rites for women who survived violations that made death preferable. The theological implications of state power overriding divine law created fractures in Russian orthodoxy that would persist for generations. Some Oprichniki developed specializations that revealed the system's bureaucratic refinement. Men known for breaking particular types of women, experts in extracting confessions through specifically gendered torture. The professionalization of sexual violence as state tool created career paths for those willing to surrender their humanity entirely. The economic impacts extended beyond immediate property confiscation. Noble families diverted resources toward protecting female members rather than productive investments. Trade relationships fractured as merchant families refused to intermarry with nobility that might be targeted. The systematic assault on women became an assault on social structures that had organized Russian society for centuries. Medical knowledge of the era, limited as it was, still recognized patterns in the injuries these women sustained. Physicians developed treatment protocols for specific types of trauma. Midwives learned to identify pregnancies resulting from Oprichniki assaults. The healing arts adapted to address wounds that previous generations of medical practitioners had never imagined treating in such numbers. The selection process for victims revealed strategic thinking. Young wives of ambitious nobles, daughters of families with competing claims to influence. Women whose beauty or intelligence made them stand out in court settings. The targeting wasn't random but calculated to maximum social disruption through individual destruction. Survival strategies among noble women evolved rapidly. Some adopted extreme religious devotion, hoping piety might offer protection. Others cultivated illness, believing sick women might be overlooked. The lengths to which women went to make themselves undesirable targets created its own form of social distortion. The Oprichnike's own evolution during this period tracked in their changing methods. Early assaults showed passionate brutality. Later ones demonstrated mechanical efficiency. The transformation from heated violence to cold methodology marked the system's maturation into something more terrifying than simple cruelty. International marriage negotiations involving Russian nobility effectively ceased. Foreign courts wouldn't risk their daughters in a kingdom where state-sanctioned rape had become policy. This diplomatic isolation compounded Russia's other problems, creating cascading consequences from Ivan's systematic violence against his own nobility's women. The women who survived these assaults faced continued punishment through social death, laws that formally polluted them, economic regulations that stripped their property rights, religious restrictions that limited their movements. The state ensured that survival itself became another form of ongoing torture. Some historians argue these systematic assaults represented Ivan's most effective terror tool. Executions created martyrs and ended suffering. Imprisonment required resources and created security risks. But violated women walking through Moscow's streets provided visible, permanent reminders of the price of resistance. Their continued existence testified to power more completely than any corpse. The generational trauma embedded itself in Russian noble culture. Mothers who couldn't protect daughters passed down guilt that poisoned relationships. Fathers who failed to defend wives carried shame that shaped how they raised sons. The violence rippled through time, affecting families decades after the immediate threat had passed. By winter's end in 1569, thousands of women across Russia bore the physical and psychological wounds of systematic state violence. Their suffering had achieved its purpose, creating a nobility too terrorized to oppose Ivan's increasingly erratic rule. But the cost measured not just in individual trauma, but in the transformation of an entire society's understanding of power, gender, and human dignity. The Oprichniki had perfected their methods. Noble families had learned their vulnerability. The infrastructure of sexual violence as political tool stood ready for expanded application. What had been tested on individuals could be scaled to entire populations. The arithmetic of terror suggested new possibilities that even Ivan's twisted imagination had not yet fully explored. In the archives of foreign embassies, in the fragmentary records of convents that sheltered survivors, in the architectural adaptations of noble houses, the evidence accumulated. Russia had witnessed something new in the annals of state power. Not just the use of sexual violence in governance, but its bureaucratization, its refinement into an administrative tool as regular as tax collection and far more effective at ensuring compliance. The women who endured this systematic horror left few words of their own. Their stories survive in silences, in the gaps where records stop abruptly, in the statistical anomalies of noble families that simply vanished from historical mention. But their suffering carved channels in Russian society through which future tyrannies would flow, establishing precedents that would echo through centuries. These were acts of individual terror. But what if Ivan applied this logic to an entire city? What would that apocalypse look like? The frozen Volkhov River held its breath. Citizens of Novgorod had lived beside these waters for centuries, watching merchants sail to distant lands, children learning to skate on winter ice, lovers meeting on its banks during white summer nights. They didn't know their river would soon run red beneath sheets of ice, that the water blessing their city would become its curse. January 1570 brought riders from Moscow, not the usual tax collectors or administrative clerks, but men whose approach silenced market squares. The letter they carried to Archbishop Pimen bore Ivan's seal, its contents charging Novgorod with negotiating secret alliance with Poland. The evidence consisted of a single intercepted message, its authenticity questionable, its implications absolute. Every bell in the city's famous churches fell silent that day, as if the bronze itself understood what was coming. Novgorod had always been different from other Russian cities. Its citizens elected their own leaders, traded freely with European merchants, maintained libraries that preserved knowledge from Byzantium and beyond. This independence had irritated Moscow's rulers for generations. The city's wealth, accumulated through centuries of commerce, made it second only to Moscow itself. That prosperity would seal its fate. The archbishop read Ivan's letter 3 times before his hands stopped shaking. Around him, church officials exchanged glances that carried entire conversations. They knew the letter was fabricated, everyone knew, but knowing meant nothing when the Tsar had already decided. The mathematical certainty of destruction settled over Novgorod like snow, soft and suffocating. Word spread through the city's quarters with the speed of flame through dry timber. Merchants began hiding their gold, though they didn't know where would be safe. Mothers gathered their children closer, though walls offered no protection from what approached. The city's famous democratic assembly, the Veshe, convened for what would be its final meeting. They debated responses to charges everyone understood were pretexts, searching for words that might turn aside imperial wrath already set in motion. 500 miles away, Ivan prepared for his journey to Novgorod with the attention of a master craftsman approaching his greatest work. He selected his companions carefully, men who had proven their dedication through previous atrocities. The supply wagons carried not just provisions but specialized tools, instruments refined through years of practice on individuals now to be applied to an entire population. The preparation took weeks, every detail considered, every contingency planned. The Oprichniki who would accompany their master understood this expedition was different. Previous operations had targeted specific families, particular districts. This would be something new in scale and ambition. They sharpened their blades and practiced their techniques, preparing for work that would last not hours but weeks. Some composed songs for the journey, hymns that mixed sacred melodies with lyrics celebrating coming slaughter. Novgorod's walls had stood for 600 years. They had repelled Mongol armies, Swedish invasions, Lithuanian raids. Citizens took comfort in those ancient stones, in gates that had protected generations. They didn't understand that their greatest threat would arrive not as foreign invader, but as their own sovereign. That the walls meant to keep enemies out would soon keep victims in. The city's boyars met in secret, debating flight versus resistance versus submission. Some advocated sending emissaries to Moscow, offering treasures that might satisfy Ivan's greed without bloodshed. Others proposed activating old alliances, calling on Poland or Sweden for protection. The wisest among them said nothing, already understanding that when a Tsar decides to make an example, no earthly power can intervene. Children in Novgorod's schools continued their lessons in those final weeks, learning mathematics and languages their teachers knew they might never use. The fish merchants still called their wares in the morning markets. Blacksmiths still shaped iron into tools. The machinery of daily life continued its rotations even as everyone felt the mechanism winding down, spring coiling tighter before release. February 2nd, the Feast of Candlemas. Church bells should have rung celebration across the city. Instead, watchmen on the walls spotted the approaching column, black figures moving across white landscape like ink spilling across parchment. The Oprichniki had arrived. Behind them, travelling in grim procession, came Ivan himself. The chronicles record that birds fell silent as he passed, though this might have been February cold rather than supernatural dread. Ivan established his headquarters at Gorodish, just outside the city walls, close enough to oversee operations, far enough to avoid the mess of what he planned. The administrative precision revealed itself immediately. Lists already prepared of every prominent family, maps marking important buildings, schedules allocating different districts to different Oprichnik units. This wasn't passionate vengeance, but calculated destruction. The summons came first to the archbishop and senior clergy. They arrived at Ivan's camp expecting negotiation, perhaps harsh terms, but something survivable. Instead, they found a makeshift court, where verdicts had been decided before trials began. Ivan himself presided, his eyes carrying that particular emptiness witnesses had learned to fear. The questioning focused not on guilt or innocence, but on extracting names, expanding the web of imagined conspiracy. Archbishop Pimen tried to speak of Novgorod's centuries of loyalty, its contributions to Russian greatness. Ivan listened with the patience of a cat watching a mouse, letting the old man exhaust his words before pronouncing judgment. The archbishop would live, imprisoned but breathing. This mercy wasn't kindness but calculation. A dead archbishop might become a martyr. A broken one served better purposes. The real work began on February 3rd. Oprichniki units entered Novgorod through gates opened by terrified watchmen who chose collaboration over immediate death. They moved through streets with the efficiency of men who had rehearsed their routes, each group assigned specific targets. The methodology they had perfected on individual noble families would now scale to encompass thousands. The Petrov family woke to splintering wood and black-robed figures filling their merchant house. Mikhail Petrov had built his fortune through decades of honest trade, his warehouses full of goods from across Europe. His wife Marina had managed those enterprises with skill that made her husband's success possible. Their 3 daughters had been educated in languages and mathematics, prepared for lives as merchant wives themselves. All of that ended in the time it took to read charges of conspiracy no one pretended to believe. What followed in the Petrov household repeated across Novgorod with variations that revealed planning rather than chaos. The men, including teenage sons, were separated first. Mikhail's attempts to protect his family ended with efficient blows that left him conscious but helpless. The women faced a different protocol, one the Oprichniki had refined through years of practice. Marina's screams joined a chorus rising from houses throughout the merchant quarter. The daughters, aged 16, 14, and 12, discovered that their education and refinement made them particular targets. The Oprichniki had learned that destroying cultivated innocence created deeper wounds than violating hardened spirits. They proceeded with the patience of workers fulfilling quotas, rotating through the house's female occupants with bureaucratic thoroughness. The youngest girl's attempts to hide behind her sisters only delayed the inevitable. Outside, other units worked through the quarter with similar efficiency. The Volkov family's fate differed only in details. The Sokolovs lasted slightly longer before their door gave way. House by house, family by family, the merchant quarter that had been Novgorod's pride became a laboratory for systematic horror. The screams blended into a sound that witnesses compared to wind through winter forests, constant and inhuman. The temporal authorities faced their own protocol. Boyar Fyodor Dubrovinsky had governed Novgorod's legal system for 20 years. His reputation for fairness had made him beloved among common citizens who now watched from windows as Oprichniki dragged him through streets he had walked with dignity. His wife Yelena followed, her noble bearing intact despite torn clothing and visible bruises. Their children came last, the youngest boy no more than 5, all bound for the frozen river. The Volkov had frozen solid that winter, ice thick enough to support loaded wagons. The Oprichniki had tested it thoroughly, understanding weight distributions and stress points with the attention of engineers. They cut holes at carefully measured intervals, each one large enough for specific purposes. The machinery of death assembled on the ice combined primitive brutality with sophisticated understanding of psychology. Mothers arrived at the river to find their children already positioned. The Oprichniki had learned that separating families, then reuniting them at the moment of execution, created particular types of anguish. Yelena Dubrovinsky found her children tied together, the older ones trying to comfort the youngest. Her husband stood nearby, beaten but aware enough to comprehend what would happen. The reunion lasted just long enough for recognition before the real performance began. The method had been tested and refined. Children tied to parents with ropes calculated to ensure they sank together. The holes in the ice positioned so those waiting their turn could see what awaited them. Priests forced to give final blessings to congregants they had baptized, married, comforted through life's passages. Everything designed for maximum witness, maximum comprehension, maximum despair. Young Pavel Dubrovinsky went into the water holding his mother's hand. The cold would have killed them quickly, but the Oprichniki had learned to weight bodies so they remained visible beneath clear ice. Future groups would see previous victims suspended below, faces turned upward as if pleading for help that would never come. The psychological impact multiplied with each family added to the underwater gallery. The efficiency staggered even hardened observers. Units worked in shifts to maintain energy. Scribes recorded names and confiscated properties. Medical personnel ensured that valuable prisoners survived for further interrogation. The frozen river became a factory floor where human beings were processed with industrial precision centuries before industrialization. Between the drownings, other entertainments occupied the Oprichniki. Noble daughters discovered that rape was merely prelude to more creative degradations. The Novgorod Chronicle, written by monks who witnessed events from monastery walls, describes scenes that test the boundaries of language. Women forced to dance naked on ice until exhaustion claimed them. Children made to watch their mothers violated by entire units. Tortures that revealed anatomical knowledge applied to maximize suffering while prolonging consciousness. The merchant Ivan Shabanov tried to buy his family's safety with gold hidden for such emergencies. The Oprichniki took his treasure, then proceeded with their original plan. His wife's assault lasted through the night, while Shabanov was forced to watch. His daughters faced similar fates. When morning came, the entire family went to the river, their bodies bearing wounds that told their own stories. The gold that failed to save them funded continued operations. Days blended into nights of unrelenting horror. The Oprichniki worked through Novgorod's quarters with the steady pace of harvesters in a field. The noble district on Monday, merchant quarters on Tuesday, craftsmen on Wednesday. Each day brought refined techniques as units shared innovations that improved efficiency. The human capacity for creating suffering proved as limitless as the capacity to endure it. The city's famous churches offered no sanctuary. Ivan had decided that Novgorod's religious independence contributed to its treason. Monks found themselves dragged from cells where they had spent decades in prayer. Nuns discovered that religious vows provided no protection from men who had moved beyond any fear of divine judgment. The Cathedral of St. Sophia, masterpiece of medieval architecture, became a torture chamber where screams echoed off walls that had heard centuries of hymns. Father Alexander had served that cathedral for 30 years. He had baptized half of Novgorod, performed marriages that created the families now being destroyed. The Oprichniki saved special attention for him, understanding that breaking the city's spiritual leader would damage morale more than 100 random deaths. They proceeded methodically, using techniques that left him physically capable of continued suffering while destroying everything that had made him a source of comfort to his congregation. The nuns of the Intercession convent thought their walls might provide protection. Sister Marfa, the elderly abbess, had prepared her charges for martyrdom if necessary. She hadn't prepared them for what actually came. The Oprichniki entered during night prayers, moving through the chapel with practiced efficiency. What followed over the next 3 days tested the boundaries of human endurance. The detailed accounts left by foreign merchants who later found survivors suggest systematic sexual torture that exploited every aspect of religious life. Children throughout Novgorod learned terrible lessons during those weeks. They watched parents who had seemed all-powerful reduced to begging animals. They saw social structures that had organized their world dissolved in blood and terror. Some were forced to participate in their family's destruction, choices that would poison the rest of their lives. Others simply vanished into the machinery of death, their fates unrecorded except as statistics. The economic destruction paralleled the human catastrophe. Warehouses that had stored goods from across Europe burned with their contents. The Oprichniki took what they wanted, destroyed what they couldn't carry. Centuries of accumulated wealth vanished in days. Trade agreements became meaningless paper. The commercial networks that had made Novgorod great collapsed as surely as its murdered merchants. Ivan himself toured the destruction with the satisfaction of an artist reviewing his masterpiece. He moved through scenes of horror with perfect calm, occasionally offering suggestions that revealed deep contemplation of suffering's possibilities. Witnesses describe him stopping to watch particular tortures, taking notes like a scholar observing natural phenomena. His presence transformed atrocity into performance, with Oprichniki competing to impress their master. The international community watched in paralyzed horror. The English merchants who maintained a compound in Novgorod sent coded messages home describing the death of a great city by its own father's hand. The Hanseatic League's representatives fled when they could, carrying stories that would make Novgorod synonymous with massacre across Europe. But no foreign power intervened. The lesson was clear. Within his borders, Ivan's power remained absolute. Some citizens attempted resistance that the official chronicles naturally minimize. Groups of young men tried to defend their districts, armed with whatever weapons they could find. They lasted minutes against trained Oprichniki. Women poisoned wine supplies, hoping to kill their attackers. A few succeeded, before the practice was discovered and countered. These fragments of defiance accomplished little except adding to the death toll, but they revealed that human spirit persisted even in hell's depths. The priests who survived faced unique torment, forced to consecrate the murders of their congregants, made to perform marriage ceremonies between Oprichniki and women they were actively raping, required to give Christian burial to victims while their families were being tortured nearby. The perversion of religious ritual into an instrument of torture revealed sophisticated understanding of psychological destruction. By the third week, the Volkov had claimed so many bodies that the ice began to crack under their weight. The Oprichniki adapted, finding new methods that didn't depend on the frozen river. Impalement became popular, with victims arranged in patterns that created grotesque art installations. Mass burnings offered efficiency and spectacle. The creativity applied to death seemed inexhaustible. The children who survived often did so through transformations that horrified their relatives more than death would have. Boys, who joined the Oprichniki to save themselves. Girls who became camp followers, trading degradation for continued breath. These adaptations created divisions within families that survived, poisoning relationships with questions about the price of survival and who had paid it. The final phase focused on ensuring Novgorod could never recover. Young women of childbearing age received special attention, violations designed to prevent future generations. The Oprichniki had learned that certain injuries made pregnancy impossible or deadly. They applied this knowledge systematically, treating women's bodies as another resource to be destroyed in service of their master's vision. The death toll remains disputed. Conservative estimates place it at 15,000. Others suggest 60,000, nearly the entire population. The exact number matters less than the completeness of destruction. Novgorod had been Russia's second city, a center of trade and culture that rivaled Moscow. In 5 weeks, it became a charnel house that would never fully recover. The last days brought a kind of mechanical exhaustion to the slaughter. Even the Oprichniki seemed to tire of endless violence. The final victims died with less ceremony, simple execution replacing elaborate torture. The frozen river, clogged with bodies, no longer served its purpose. Pyres burned day and night, disposing of evidence that was already seared into survivors' memories. Ivan declared the purification complete on February 27th. He attended a final mass in the Cathedral of St. Sophia, its walls still stained with blood despite attempts at cleaning. The ceremony proceeded with perfect Orthodox ritual, as if the previous weeks hadn't transformed sacred space into a slaughterhouse. The surviving priests performed their roles with blank faces, automatons going through motions that had lost all meaning. The withdrawal began immediately. Oprichniki units loaded their plunder onto wagons that groaned under the weight. Gold, furs, artworks accumulated over centuries, all headed for Moscow or Ivan's personal treasury. They left behind a city that barely qualified as such anymore. Entire districts stood empty. The famous market squares that had bustled with international trade held only frozen corpses and scavenging dogs. Survivors emerged slowly, like animals after a forest fire. They found their city transformed beyond recognition. Families that had numbered in dozens reduced to single digits. Children wandering streets looking for parents who would never answer. Women bearing injuries that marked them as permanently polluted under laws that blamed victims for their suffering. The mathematics were simple. Novgorod the Great had died. What remained was a ghost wearing its name. The international reaction came swiftly but toothlessly. European courts expressed horror while continuing diplomatic relations. The Pope issued condemnations that meant nothing to Orthodox Russia. Trade resumed within months, though now Moscow held monopoly where Novgorod had once competed. The lesson for foreign powers was clear. Moral outrage mattered less than commercial necessity. The Oprichniki returned to Moscow as heroes. They had proven that destruction could scale from individuals to entire cities. The techniques refined in Novgorod's quarters would be applied elsewhere with increased efficiency. Ivan rewarded his most creative torturers with estates stripped from their victims. The system had validated itself through successful application. For the scattered survivors in Novgorod, life continued in forms that mocked the word. Women who had managed great merchant houses begged in streets where they had once commanded respect. Children grew feral in ruins of homes where they'd learned to read. The city's famous bells remained silent, their ringers dead or fled. Even time seemed to move differently in a place where normal life had been so thoroughly erased. Years later, visitors described Novgorod as a city that felt haunted in daylight. Buildings stood empty because there weren't enough people to fill them. Grass grew in market squares that had once hosted merchants from across the known world. The frozen river flowed normally each spring, but fishermen reported catches that tasted of copper and children who wouldn't play on winter ice. The true casualty count extended far beyond the dead. Every survivor carried wounds that shaped how they raised children, conducted business, understood the world. The virus of trauma infected generations, creating a population that knew from birth what their government was capable of and adjusted their dreams accordingly. Novgorod had been murdered, but worse, it had been forced to continue existing as proof of what happened to those who attracted royal displeasure. The massacre entered Russian language as a reference point for absolute destruction. To be sent to Novgorod meant more than death. It meant the complete erasure of everything that made life worth living. Ivan had created new vocabulary for suffering, expanding Russians' ability to describe horror through practical demonstration. The theological implications troubled those who still maintained faith. If God permitted such atrocities, what did that say about divine justice? If the Church proved powerless to protect even its own servants, what authority did it retain? These questions, whispered in what remained of Novgorod's religious community, would echo through Russian orthodoxy for generations. The economic transformation proved as lasting as the human destruction. With Novgorod eliminated as competition, Moscow's commercial dominance became absolute. Trade routes redirected through the capital. International merchants who had cultivated relationships in Novgorod over generations found themselves starting fresh with Moscow bureaucrats. The massacre had been many things, but it was also a hostile takeover executed with unprecedented violence. Some historians argue Novgorod's destruction marked the true birth of Russian autocracy. Previous rulers had been constrained by tradition, nobility, geographic distance. Ivan demonstrated that these limits existed only until a sovereign chose to ignore them. The precedent was set. Russian rulers could destroy entire cities if they wished. The only check on power was the ruler's own restraint, and Ivan had shown how little that meant. The Oprichniki themselves paid their own price for Novgorod. Many reported nightmares that vodka couldn't drown. Suicide rates among veterans of the massacre spiked in following years. Some sought extreme religious penance, though few monasteries would accept men whose sins seemed beyond divine forgiveness. They had discovered that human beings could become instruments of pure destruction, but the transformation was irreversible. For Ivan, Novgorod represented complete success. He had identified a threat, real or imagined, and eliminated it so thoroughly that the very possibility of such threat recurring died with the city. The mathematical elegance appealed to his increasingly abstract view of governance. If one city's destruction could ensure 1,000 others' compliance, wasn't that arithmetic worth any amount of blood? The techniques pioneered in Novgorod spread through the Russian administrative system. Regional governors learned to apply collective punishment for individual crimes. The concept of proportional response disappeared, replaced by overwhelming retaliation for any challenge to authority. Novgorod had been a teaching moment, its lessons written in the universal language of terror. Yet even absolute destruction has limits. Stories survived in songs children sang when no authorities could hear. Names of the dead preserved in monastery records hidden from official inspection. The memory of what Novgorod had been before February 1570 became its own form of resistance, keeping alive the possibility that Russians had once lived differently. The physical ruins gradually disappeared. New buildings rose where massacres had occurred. Fresh paint covered bloodstains. But certain corners of the city retained an atmosphere that made horses shy and children cry. Locals learned which streets to avoid after dark, which buildings stood empty despite housing shortages. The geography of atrocity embedded itself in urban planning. The final assessment of Novgorod's destruction reveals the terrible efficiency of systematic cruelty applied with state resources. Previous massacres in history had been passionate affairs, driven by ethnic hatred or religious fury. This was different, calculated, bureaucratic, designed to achieve specific political goals through human suffering, calibrated for maximum impact. It was perhaps the first modern atrocity, using medieval tools but contemporary organizational methods. The silence that fell over Novgorod after the Oprichniki departed was different from peace. It was the quiet of a mass grave, the hush of spaces where human voices had been systematically eliminated. Birds returned eventually, and life in its most basic forms continued. But something essential had been murdered along with the people. The idea that cities could exist independently, that local tradition could balance central authority, that there were limits to what power could do to its subjects. The ghosts of Novgorod haunted more than its empty buildings. They followed Ivan back to Moscow in the form of new knowledge about governance through atrocity. They spread across Russia as techniques of collective punishment became standard administrative practice. They whispered in the ears of future rulers who would remember that entire cities could be erased if necessity or paranoia demanded it. The merchants who had fled returned to find their world unmade. The craftsmen discovered their workshops looted and their apprentices dead. The farmers found their markets vanished along with their customers. Everyone who had survived learned the same lesson. In the mathematics of autocracy, individual lives were fractions that could be reduced to zero whenever the equation demanded it. Decades later, travelers to Novgorod reported a city that functioned but never thrived. Like a person who had survived catastrophic injury, it continued through the motions of existence without the spark that had once made it exceptional. The Volkhov River flowed as it always had, but locals claimed it whispered names on winter nights, reciting the litany of those who lay beneath ice that February. The true legacy of Novgorod's destruction lay not in the bodies counted, but in the possibilities revealed. If a great city could be systematically destroyed by its own government, if thousands could be tortured and murdered with bureaucratic efficiency, if human beings could be transformed into instruments capable of such acts, then what limits remained on state power? The answer, written in blood on Novgorod's snow, was simple. There were no limits at all. But annihilation on this scale seems like madness. Was there cold, brutal logic behind it? The calculations began in the treasury. Gold from Novgorod's merchant houses weighed against the cost of operations. Property seized from executed nobles, catalogued with the precision of a merchant's ledger. Human destruction rendered into columns of profit and loss, each family's annihilation producing quantifiable gains for the state. Ivan's scribes worked through the night, transforming horror into mathematics that justified itself through its own success. The economic logic proved irresistible. One executed boyar might inspire revenge from his sons, but a boyar whose wife suffered in a convent, whose daughters disappeared into Oprichnik brothels, whose infant grandchildren drowned in frozen rivers, that boyar's entire lineage ceased to threaten the throne. The arithmetic of extinction operated with brutal efficiency. Consider the Rostov conspiracy that never was. Prince Vladimir Rostov had expressed concern about new taxation at a council meeting. Nothing treasonous, merely the observation that starving peasants produced no revenue. Within days, Ivan's accountants calculated the total wealth controlled by families connected to Rostov through marriage, business, or simple friendship. The sum exceeded the annual tribute from 3 provinces. The next calculation involved risk assessment. How many armed men could these families muster if united in rebellion? How much influence did they wield in the church? Which foreign powers might support them if pushed to desperation? Each factor received numerical weight in formulas that reduced human networks to mathematical problems requiring solutions. The solution emerged with elegant simplicity. Rather than execute Rostov and create a martyr, the system would digest his entire network over months. His wife Elena went to a convent where specific privations were calculated to break her within a season. His 3 daughters, aged between 12 and 19, vanished into Oprichnik custody, where their systematic violation served multiple purposes. His sons were separated and sent to different frontier garrisons where mortality rates exceeded 70%, but the true genius lay in the extended consequences. Rostov's merchant partners found their licenses revoked. Families that had intermarried with the Rostovs discovered their own names appearing on lists. The contamination spread through social networks like a carefully designed disease, each connection becoming a liability that forced friends to abandon friends, cousins to denounce cousins. The seized assets funded expanded Oprichniki operations. Gold that might have built churches or funded trade expeditions now paid for more black riders, more convents converted to prisons, more instruments of psychological destruction. The system became self-funding, each wave of terror generating resources for the next. Ivan had discovered perpetual motion in human suffering. Foreign observers marveled at the precision, while recoiling from its application. The English ambassador wrote that Ivan had reduced governance to a mathematical science where human bodies serve as units of calculation. The Ottoman envoy, no stranger to imperial cruelty, noted that even his sultan balanced terror with the need for productive subjects. Ivan had transcended such concerns, treating his nobility as a resource to be consumed rather than maintained. The demographic impacts revealed themselves in census data that survives in monastery archives. Entire family trees simply end. Noble lineages that traced their ancestry to Kievan Rus vanish between one recording and the next. The mathematical elegance of these disappearances, pruned, whole branches pruned with no loose ends, testified to systematic planning, rather than random violence. Military considerations added another dimension to Ivan's calculations. Traditional armies depended on noble cavalry, men who fought for honor and land their families had held for generations. By destroying those families, seizing those lands, Ivan created a military that depended entirely on his favor. Soldiers without ancestral homes fought for pay and plunder. Officers without family networks showed loyalty only to the system that created them. The Oprichniki recruitment benefited from this social destruction. Young men from annihilated families faced stark choices: starve on the streets, flee to uncertain exile, or join the force that had destroyed their world. Many chose the black robes, transforming from victims to perpetrators in a psychological alchemy Ivan understood perfectly. Each converted enemy became a double victory. DHE. One less potential rebel, one more absolutely dependent servant. The convents filled with women whose maintenance cost less than execution while providing greater utility. A dead noblewoman inspired sympathy and potentially revenge. A woman slowly dying in religious captivity served as permanent reminder while generating no martyrdom. The actuarial tables showed that most would die within 5 years from malnutrition and despair, but those 5 years of visible suffering multiplied the investment in their destruction. Children presented special calculations. Young enough to forget their origins, they could be remolded into perfect servants of the new order. Too old, and family memories might inspire future revenge. Ivan's administrators developed precise age matrices. Children under 5 went to Oprichniki families for raising. Those between 6 and 10 entered state schools designed to erase previous identity. Older children faced gender-specific fates that maximized their utility to the system, while preventing future threat. The international implications factored into every decision. European powers that might have protested the execution of a single prominent noble found themselves overwhelmed by the scale of systematic destruction. Diplomatic complaints about particular atrocities got lost in the sheer volume. By the time foreign courts formulated responses to one massacre, 3 more had occurred. The mathematics of outrage exhaustion worked in Ivan's favor. Trade agreements required constant recalculation as merchant families vanished. The Hanseatic League's careful negotiations with Novgorod's trading houses became worthless paper when those houses ceased to exist. New agreements with Moscow reflected monopoly pricing that enriched Ivan's treasury. The destruction of commercial competition through terror proved more effective than any traditional economic policy. Religious factors complicated the equations. The Orthodox Church commanded spiritual authority that even Ivan couldn't simply eliminate. but he could calculate precisely how much pressure individual clergymen could withstand before breaking. The systematic violation of nuns, the torture of priests, the desecration of holy spaces, all calibrated to break religious resistance without creating unified opposition. The few who achieved martyrdom were overwhelmed by the many who capitulated. The psychological mathematics proved most sophisticated. Ivan's advisors had learned that fear operated according to predictable patterns. Anticipation multiplied suffering. Uncertainty prevented organized resistance. Intermittent reinforcement, random arrests followed by unexpected releases, created more compliance than consistent brutality. They developed formulas for optimal terror that would be studied by tyrants for centuries. Population replacement followed careful planning. As noble families vanished, new men filled their positions. But these replacements came from backgrounds that ensured dependence. Foreign mercenaries, with no local connections. Peasants elevated beyond their dreams who understood their fall would be twice as far. Former criminals who knew their pardons could be revoked instantly. Each replacement was calculated to be more controllable than what they replaced. The geographic distribution of terror followed strategic patterns. Border regions that might seek foreign support received attention first. Commercial centers that generated independent wealth faced systematic destruction. Religious centers that might coordinate spiritual resistance found themselves infiltrated and neutralized. The map of Oprichniki operations revealed strategic thinking that treated Russia as a complex organism requiring specific surgery. Agricultural impacts entered the calculations late but proved significant. Destroying noble families meant disrupting estate management that had evolved over centuries. Peasants found themselves without traditional protections, subject to new masters who extracted maximum profit without thought for sustainability. Crop yields fell. Famine followed. But even starvation served Ivan's purposes by weakening potential resistance. The feedback loops built into the system ensured its continuation. Oprichniki, who showed insufficient enthusiasm, faced suspicion themselves. Administrators who questioned methods joined the victim lists. The only safety lay in exceeding expectations for cruelty. This competitive dynamic drove innovations in horror that surprised even Ivan with their effectiveness. Record-keeping transformed from administrative necessity to weapon. The detailed documentation of every arrest, every confiscation, every family destroyed, created archives of terror. Future targets could read exactly what had happened to others, imagining their own names in those records. The bureaucracy of fear proved as effective as its physical manifestations. The cultural calculations revealed long-term thinking. By targeting educated women, Ivan prevented the transmission of alternative narratives to future generations. By traumatizing children, he created a population that would accept autocracy as natural law. By destroying libraries and archives, he erased evidence that Russians had ever lived differently. The mathematics of cultural genocide operated alongside physical destruction. Legal frameworks evolved to support the system. New laws made family relationships, criminal liabilities, property rights became conditional on political loyalty that could be revoked retroactively. The crime of insufficient enthusiasm for state policies allowed prosecution of anyone who failed to celebrate their neighbor's destruction. Law became algorithm, processing human inputs according to predetermined outcomes. The economic efficiency surprised even Ivan's treasury officials. Traditional warfare consumed resources. This system generated them. Every destroyed family funded further operations. The mathematics created a perpetual engine of redistribution that enriched the state while eliminating potential opposition. Advisors from other countries studied the model, though few dared implement it fully. Sexual violence entered the calculations as force multiplier. One woman violated in front of her family traumatized dozens of witnesses. The mathematical precision of using women's bodies as weapons against entire communities revealed planning that treated human anatomy as another resource for exploitation. The long-term demographic impacts, women unable to bear children, families too traumatized to form, served strategic purposes. The selection algorithms grew increasingly sophisticated. Early operations targeted obvious threats. Later calculations identified potential future opposition based on family histories, economic success, education levels, foreign connections. Predictive persecution eliminated threats before they materialized. The mathematics of prevention through terror reached new levels of abstraction. Resistance, when it came, validated Ivan's calculations. The few attempts at organized opposition were betrayed by participants seeking to save themselves. The system had created conditions where solidarity became mathematically impossible. Every potential ally was also potential informant. Trust died in the equations that made betrayal the only rational choice. The Oprichniki veterans who survived to write memoirs described their work in numerical terms: bodies processed per day, confiscations per week. The transformation of human beings into statistics wasn't incidental but essential to the work. Mathematics created distance from acts that would be unbearable if perceived in human terms. By 1570, Ivan could point to ledgers that proved his system's success. Opposition eliminated, treasury enriched, power consolidated. The human costs appeared nowhere in these calculations, deemed irrelevant to equations that measured only state benefit. The perfection of autocracy through applied mathematics had achieved results that impressed observers even as it horrified them. The international response evolved from outrage to analysis. Foreign courts that had condemned the atrocities began studying their methods. The mathematical elegance of destroying opposition through calculated cruelty inspired imitators who lacked Ivan's complete commitment. Half measures failed where total application succeeded, validating Ivan's absolutist approach. Future historians would struggle to reconcile the bureaucratic precision with the human horror. How could the same minds that calculated optimal terror patterns have been human themselves? The answer lay in the mathematics itself. Once human beings became units in equations, their suffering transformed into data points. The system's logic consumed those who operated it as thoroughly as those it targeted. The legacy persisted in Russian governance long after Ivan's death. The understanding that families could be weapons, that terror could be calculated, that human destruction could fund state operations became embedded in administrative thinking. Future rulers might moderate the extremes, but the mathematical framework remained. Power meant the ability to reduce humans to numbers and solve for maximum control. The brilliance and horror lay in the same source. Treating governance as engineering problem where human bodies were materials to be processed. No hatred was required. No passion needed. Just the calm application of formulas that transformed living beings into state resources. The mathematical beauty of the system was inseparable from its absolute evil. Ivan had answered the fundamental question of autocracy. How does one man control millions? The solution required no advanced technology, no vast armies, no supernatural power, just the willingness to apply mathematical thinking to human destruction. The equations balanced, the system functioned, the logic was perfect. And that perfection was precisely what made it the greatest horror of all. The fields lay empty, not the productive emptiness of winter waiting for spring planting, but the barren silence of land whose workers had vanished. Weeds choked irrigation channels that generations had maintained. Manor houses stood with doors hanging open, their halls echoing with absence. Russia's economy was bleeding out through 10,000 wounds. The merchant Grigory Volkov discovered the new reality when he arrived at the Tver estate to collect his autumn grain payment. The granaries stood empty. The account books showed careful records until mid-September. Then nothing. The estate manager's cottage contained overturned furniture and dark stains the rain hadn't washed away. In Moscow's treasury, clerks struggled with mathematics that no longer balanced. Tax revenues from entire provinces had simply stopped. Trade caravans reported finding way stations abandoned, their keepers fled or dead. The intricate networks of commerce that had taken centuries to build were unraveling faster than anyone could track. Ivan had created a special commission to address the crisis. The same minds that had calculated optimal terror now faced equations where the numbers ran only one direction: downward, always downward. The Novgorod revenues alone represented a catastrophe. Where that city had once contributed nearly a quarter of the state's income, now came only silence and unpaid obligations. The international merchants who had made Novgorod their hub redirected operations through Riga and Stockholm. Russia's window to European trade had been shattered by its own ruler's hand. Commissioner Alexei Adashev presented his findings in the throne room, where courtiers stood in careful formations of fear. The agricultural reports painted a portrait of systematic collapse. Noble estates that had fed Moscow now produced nothing, not through drought or plague, but because the families who understood their management had been erased. The Sheremetev lands stretched across 3 provinces. 5,000 peasants had worked those fields under careful supervision refined across generations. The family had developed crop rotation methods that maximized yields in Russia's harsh climate. They maintained seed stores against bad harvests. Their managers knew each field's peculiarities, which responded well to rye, which needed longer fallow periods. All that knowledge had drowned in the Volkov with the last Sheremetev daughter. The new owner, an Oprichniki colonel rewarded for his enthusiasm during the Novgorod operation, understood violence, but not agriculture. His attempts to maintain production through threats and beatings only accelerated the collapse. Peasants fled into the forests. Those who remained worked with the sullen inefficiency of people who knew their labor enriched their families' killers. By spring planting, the Sheremetev lands would produce less than 1/10 of their historical yields. This pattern repeated across Russia like a plague, spreading through economic systems rather than human bodies. The Dolgorukov estates in the south, the Mstislavsky holdings along the Volga, the Kurbsky properties near the Lithuanian border, each represented centuries of accumulated agricultural knowledge destroyed in afternoons of calculated terror. Urban commerce fared no better. Moscow's great market squares still filled each morning, but the sophisticated trade networks that had supplied them were hemorrhaging. The Stroganov family had managed fur trading routes stretching to Siberia. Their expertise in negotiating with indigenous peoples, their knowledge of seasonal patterns, their carefully maintained relationships had taken generations to develop. The family no longer existed, their senior men executed, their women in convents, their children scattered to the winds. The fur trade continued, but crudely. Where the Stroganovs had sustained yields through careful management, their replacements stripped territories bare. Native peoples who had dealt honorably with familiar faces now faced strangers who understood only force. Trade became raid. Sustainable harvest became plunder that would exhaust resources within years. Commissioner Adashev's voice grew quieter as he presented figures that revealed the true scope of destruction. State revenues down by 40%, international trade reduced by half, agricultural production falling with no bottom in sight. The numbers told a story of a country consuming itself. In the throne room's shadows, Ivan's remaining courtiers absorbed these facts while calculating their own survival. Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky had thus far escaped the purges through careful silence and enthusiastic compliance. Now he watched the commissioner's presentation with the attention of someone who understood that even discussing economic collapse might be interpreted as criticism. The ironworkers of Tula had stopped producing, not through strike or rebellion, but because the merchant families who had supplied their raw materials and distributed their products had been swept away. The forges that had armed Russian warriors for centuries cooled while workers waited for orders that never came, materials that couldn't be delivered, payment that no one authorized. Leather production in Pskov, textile weaving in Suzdal, salt extraction along the northern coasts. Each industry depended on networks of expertise that the terror had shattered like ice beneath spring Sunday. The replacements Ivan appointed were men skilled in violence and loyalty, virtues that meant nothing when negotiating trade agreements or managing complex production processes. Foreign observers reported home with amazement at the economic suicide they witnessed. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Russia was destroying its own capacity to function as a state. The English merchants noted opportunities to exploit the chaos, but worried about the long-term viability of their trading partner. Within Russia, those who understood economics faced an impossible position. Speaking truth about the collapse risked accusation of treason. Remaining silent guaranteed continued deterioration. Some chose elaborate metaphors, discussing the realm's health in medical terms that might slip past suspicious listeners. Others simply focused on their own survival, while the larger system crumbled around them. The military implications emerged with stark clarity during the autumn campaigns. Armies that had once moved with disciplined efficiency now struggled to maintain basic supplies. The procurement system that fed soldiers depended on noble families who understood regional resources. With those families destroyed, military commanders found themselves guessing at logistics. General Boris Sheremetev the Younger, one of the few experienced commanders to survive the purges, reported from the western frontier. His troops were deserting not from cowardice, but from hunger. The supply convoys that should have reached them had never been organized. The local nobles who would have coordinated provisions were dead or fled. His army was melting away like snow in spring Sunday. The Oprichniki themselves began feeling the economic consequences of their success. Their payments came irregularly as tax revenues dried up. The estates they had been granted as rewards proved less valuable when there was no one competent to manage them. Some began supplementing their income through freelance terror, extracting wealth from anyone too weak to resist. This privatization of violence accelerated the economic spiral. Merchants who had survived the official purges now faced random predation. Trade became impossible when any successful transaction might attract black-robed attention. Markets that had functioned through trust and routine transformed into spaces of fear where only the desperate still gathered. The demographic catastrophe compounded every economic problem. Whole categories of skilled workers had vanished. The scribes who maintained commercial records, the translators who facilitated international trade, the estate managers who understood crop rotation and peasant psychology. Russia had beheaded its own expertise in afternoon orgies of violence. Training replacements would take generations, even if systematic education existed. But the schools and monasteries that had preserved knowledge found themselves under suspicion. Learning itself became dangerous when literacy might enable reading foreign correspondence or writing suspicious thoughts. The institutions that could have rebuilt human capital instead focused on mere survival. Regional variations in the collapse revealed the terror's uneven geography. Areas that had experienced direct Oprichniki attention suffered immediate catastrophe. Provinces that had merely witnessed neighboring destruction experienced slower deterioration as fear paralyzed initiative. The few regions temporarily spared became overwhelmed with refugees whose desperation strained any remaining functionality. Moscow itself transformed from showcase capital to economic parasite. With productive regions failing, the city depended increasingly on extraction rather than exchange. What couldn't be purchased was simply taken. The Oprichniki enforced collection quotas that bore no relationship to actual capacity, demanding grain from estates that produced none, requiring taxes from merchants whose businesses had evaporated. The city's population swelled with displaced persons, even as its ability to feed them diminished. Former nobles begged in streets where they had once ridden in carriages. Skilled craftsmen competed for day labor that paid in bread. Children, who should have been learning trades, instead learned which garbage heaps might yield edible scraps. International credit evaporated as Russia demonstrated its willingness to destroy its own productive capacity. The Hanseatic League merchants, who had extended generous terms based on centuries of reliable trade, now demanded payment in advance. When that payment couldn't be arranged due to bureaucratic paralysis, trade routes shifted permanently away from Russian ports. The currency itself became suspect. With tax revenues collapsing and expenses mounting, Ivan's treasury began debasing coinage. Merchants who understood monetary policy better than Oprichniki administrators recognized the implications immediately. Prices rose. Confidence fell. Economic relationships that functioned on trust dissolved when that trust extended no further than the next transaction. Some regions attempted local solutions that revealed both ingenuity and desperation. Peasant communes that had lost their noble managers developed collective governance. Merchant associations tried to maintain trade routes without official sanction. These grassroots efforts sometimes succeeded temporarily, but inevitably attracted attention from authorities who saw any independent organization as potential treason. The church faced its own economic crisis. Monasteries that had depended on noble donations found their income streams severed. The systematic violation of convents had destroyed institutions that provided education and medical care. Religious festivals that had organized economic life through their calendar now passed unmarked in communities too traumatized to celebrate. By winter, even Ivan's inner circle couldn't ignore the implications. The state that had seemed so powerful when destroying internal enemies now struggled to perform basic functions. Tax collection required tax collectors who could calculate. Military campaigns needed supply officers who understood logistics. International diplomacy demanded translators who spoke foreign languages. All these categories of expertise had been targeted by association with noble families. The feedback loops accelerated. Economic collapse created desperation. Desperation bred disorder. Disorder justified further oppression. Further oppression destroyed more productive capacity. The mathematics that Ivan had applied to human destruction now operated on economic systems with equally predictable results. Western European courts that had initially condemned Ivan's atrocities began discussing a different concern. A collapsed Russia might create opportunities, but it also posed dangers. Refugees fleeing westward. Military weakness inviting Ottoman expansion northward. Trade routes disrupted across the continent. The localized catastrophe was metastasizing into regional crisis. Inside Russia, those with economic understanding faced the arithmetic of impossibility. Rebuilding would require precisely the educated, internationally connected, administratively experienced population that had been systematically eliminated. The knowledge couldn't be recreated quickly. The trust couldn't be restored by decree. The networks couldn't be rewoven by force. Commissioner Adashev concluded his report with projections that made seasoned courtiers blanch. At current rates of decline, state revenues would reach critical levels within 2 years. Military capacity was already compromised. International trade might never recover to previous levels. The document painted a portrait of a great power committing elaborate suicide. Ivan received this information with the calm of someone whose reality had long since departed from material concerns. The economic numbers meant less to him than astrological calculations or dream interpretations. His focus had shifted to enemies that existed primarily in his imagination, while real threats multiplied in the collapse his policies had created. The noble families who had built Russia's prosperity over centuries were gone. In their place stood men whose only qualification was willingness to perform violence. These new elites understood plunder but not production. They could extract wealth but not create it. They commanded through fear but couldn't inspire the voluntary cooperation that made complex economies function. Russia entered a twilight where the forms of governance continued while its substance evaporated. Officials still issued decrees that no one could implement. Armies still mustered with equipment no one could maintain. Diplomats still negotiated treaties with resources no one could guarantee. The state apparatus ground on through momentum while its foundations crumbled beneath. The winter of 1570 brought new desperation. Starvation in cities that had once been well-fed. Brigandage on roads that had once been safe. International isolation from courts that had once sought alliance. The price of absolute power was revealing itself in ledgers that recorded not just vanished wealth, but vanished capability to create wealth. The survivors adapted as humans always do. Black markets replaced official commerce. Barter substituted for debased currency. Local strongmen filled the vacuum left by legitimate authority. Russia was reverting to an earlier, cruder form of organization. The sophisticated state apparatus Ivan had inherited was dissolving back into regional warlordism. Some Oprichniki began to understand their predicament. They had been instruments in destroying the system that sustained them. Their stolen estates were worthless without competent management. Their official positions meant nothing in territories reverting to chaos. A few attempted to develop administrative skills, discovering that terror and governance required entirely different capabilities. The international consequences rippled outward in waves. Polish nobles who had complained about Russian strength now worried about Russian weakness, creating unpredictable neighbors. Swedish merchants who had resented Novgorod's competition now faced disrupted markets that hurt everyone. The Ottoman Empire watched for opportunities while calculating whether Russian collapse might destabilize their own northern borders. Inside Russia, a generation was learning that prosperity could vanish overnight. that centuries of accumulated wealth and knowledge could be destroyed in seasons of calculated terror, that the connections between noble management and peasant production, between merchant networks and urban prosperity, between international trade and domestic welfare, were more fragile than anyone had understood. The Oprichnina had achieved its purpose too well. In destroying potential opposition, it had also destroyed the human infrastructure that made Russia function. The state stood triumphant over enemies who existed mainly in Ivan's paranoid imagination, while real threats multiplied in the wreckage of what had once been Europe's most promising kingdom. Commissioner Adashev finished his presentation and waited. The silence in the throne room stretched like a living thing. Everyone understood the implications of what they had heard, but no one dared speak first. To acknowledge the catastrophe might be to accept blame for it. To propose solutions might be to admit that current policies had failed. Ivan sat motionless on his throne, eyes focused on something beyond the room's confines. His lips moved in what might have been prayer or calculation or simple madness. The man who had orchestrated Russia's systematic self-destruction showed no sign of comprehending the magnitude of what he had achieved. The courtiers waited. The silence deepened. Outside, snow began to fall on a Moscow that would never recover the prosperity it had known before the terror began. The mathematics of destruction had reached their logical conclusion. Russia was eating itself alive, and no one with the power to stop it dared to try. But the story wasn't over. In the ashes of traditional Russia, something new was taking shape. The men who had destroyed the old order now faced the question that would echo through Russian history for centuries to come. The documents tell their own story, not in the dramatic strokes of executions or the theatrical cruelty of public torture, but in the quiet arithmetic of systemic control. Each carefully preserved record, each administrative innovation, each bureaucratic refinement reveals how terror transformed from passionate outburst into cold science. In the winter of 1584, Ivan lay dying. His body, poisoned by mercury treatments for the bone disease that had tormented his final years, finally surrendered to the inevitable. But the systems he had perfected, the methodologies he had refined, the understanding that families could be weapons and love could be liability, these would outlive him by centuries. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Young Ivan had inherited a medieval state where boyar families wielded hereditary power, where local customs balanced central authority, where the Tsar was first among nobles rather than their absolute master. That Russia died somewhere between Anastasia's funeral and Novgorod's annihilation, replaced by something altogether different. What emerged was the world's first modern autocracy dressed in medieval clothing. The innovation lay not in cruelty itself. History overflows with cruel rulers, but in the systematic application of cruelty as administrative tool. Where previous tyrants had killed enemies, Ivan had discovered how to weaponize the very concept of family. Where others had used fear as blunt instrument, he had refined it into surgical precision that could destroy specific human connections while leaving bodies technically alive. The succession passed to his son Fyodor, a weak man whose gentle nature seemed almost cosmic joke after his father's reign. But Fyodor inherited more than the throne. He inherited a system where opposition had been not merely defeated but rendered mathematically impossible. The noble families that might have challenged a weak Tsar no longer existed. Their wives mouldered in convents. Their children had vanished into anonymous masses or transformed into instruments of the very system that destroyed their parents. The Oprichniki disbanded officially, but their methods had already infected the broader state apparatus. Regional governors had learned that collective punishment worked more efficiently than individual justice. Military commanders understood that holding families hostage ensured soldier loyalty better than any oath. Even church authorities had absorbed the lesson that systematic violation could break spirits more thoroughly than martyrdom. The archives from this period reveal the banality of institutionalized horror, standardized forms for processing noble wives into convents, efficiency reports comparing different methods of family separation, cost-benefit analyses of maintaining women in religious imprisonment versus allowing them to die. The language strips humanity from atrocity, transforming suffering into administrative procedure. One document, preserved in the Trinity Monastery, catalogues processing rates for different convents. The intercession convent could accommodate 30 noble wives per month, though mortality rates increased beyond 20. The Ascension convent specialized in younger women, with facilities designed for longer-term containment. The clinical precision of these records reveals minds that had traveled far from recognizing their subjects as human. The international observers who remained in Moscow after Ivan's death struggled to explain what they had witnessed. The papal envoy wrote that Russia had become a kingdom where the state has consumed the family, where power recognizes no boundary between public and private existence. The Persian ambassador noted that even his Shah, hardly squeamish about violence, maintained distinctions between political enemies and their relatives that Russia had abandoned entirely. But the truest testament to Ivan's legacy lay not in what was written, but in what was no longer possible. The very concept of noble opposition had been erased along with the families that might have embodied it. Local governance that had balanced central authority for centuries simply ceased to exist. The intricate networks of marriage, commerce, and mutual obligation that had organized Russian society dissolved into atomized individuals whose only relationship was directly to the state. The economic structures that had sustained Russia adapted to this new reality. Where family businesses had passed knowledge through generations, now state monopolies operated through appointed managers. Where merchant networks had functioned on trust built through intermarriage, now only official licenses and constant surveillance enabled trade. The human connections that make complex economies possible had been replaced by bureaucratic mechanisms that functioned poorly but ensured control. The demographic crater left by Ivan's reign took generations to fill, and what filled it was fundamentally different. The new nobility that emerged owed everything to state favor and nothing to hereditary right. They had learned that family was liability, that attachment created vulnerability, that survival required absolute submission to whoever held power. These lessons, carved into Russian society through systematic terror, would shape governance for centuries. The convents that had served as prisons gradually emptied through death rather than release. The last women who had entered as noble wives died as numbers in administrative ledgers, their names forgotten, their children unknown, but their suffering had served its purpose. Every Russian who rose to prominence thereafter understood viscerally what happened to those who opposed autocratic power, not just to them but to everyone they loved. The international implications rippled outward slowly. European courts that had condemned Ivan's methods found themselves adopting sanitized versions. The French perfected lettres de cachet that could imprison indefinitely without trial. The Spanish Inquisition studied Russian techniques for breaking family solidarity. The concept that state power could reach into private life, that women and children were legitimate targets in political conflict, spread like ideological virus from its Russian epicenter. Within Russia itself, the patterns established during Ivan's reign became foundational. Future rulers might moderate the extremes, might allow periods of relative normalcy, but the fundamental architecture remained. The understanding that autocracy meant the right to destroy not just individuals but their entire human context. That mercy properly calibrated was crueler than death. That the family, source of human meaning, could be transformed into instrument of human destruction. Peter the Great would later force nobles to shave their beards and wear Western clothing, but these superficial modernizations built upon Ivan's deeper transformation. The boyar families Peter could reshape at will existed only because Ivan had destroyed their predecessors so thoroughly that resistance had been bred out of Russian nobility. The table of ranks that seemed to create meritocracy only worked because hereditary aristocracy had been ground to powder in Oprichniki operations. The Romanov dynasty that would rule Russia for 3 centuries came to power precisely because they had survived Ivan's reign through careful submission. They inherited not just a throne but an entire system of governance that treated subjects as state property, that recognized no private sphere immune from sovereign power, that had proven mathematically that absolute autocracy was sustainable through calculated application of terror. Even the revolution that would eventually destroy the Romanovs carried Ivan's DNA. The Cheka, the NKVD, the systematic use of family members as leverage, the creation of an archipelago of suffering, RU, all these 20th century horrors had their prototypes in 16th century innovations. The Bolsheviks might have used different ideological justifications, but the methods were terrifyingly familiar to any student of Ivan's reign. Stalin himself studied Ivan's methods with the attention of an apprentice learning from a master. The show trials, the elimination of entire categories of people, the use of sexual violence as political weapon, the transformation of wives and children into extensions of their husbands' and fathers' crimes, all refined and industrialized techniques Ivan had pioneered. When Stalin rehabilitated Ivan's historical image, he was acknowledging a debt to the teacher who had shown that human beings could be reduced to mathematical units in equations of power. The physical monuments to Ivan's reign gradually crumbled or were repurposed. The Oprichniki headquarters at Alexandrova Sloboda became a museum. The convents that had held noble wives returned to religious functions. The killing fields of Novgorod built over with new construction. But the invisible monuments, the patterns of thought and governance carved into Russian consciousness, proved more durable than any stone. Modern visitors to Russia often note a particular quality in how Russians relate to authority, a deep fatalism about power's arbitrary nature combined with fierce protection of private life from state intrusion. This schizophrenia has roots in Ivan's demonstrations that privacy was illusion, that the state could reach anywhere, that loving someone created vulnerability, that power would exploit. The defensive crouch of the Russian soul, beautiful in its resilience and tragic in its necessity, was shaped in the crucible of systematic terror that made the personal political centuries before that phrase was coined. The Western observers who condemn Russian autocracy often fail to understand its origins in specific historical trauma. The acceptance of strongman rule, the suspicion of democratic institutions, the preference for order over freedom, Ivan Buther, all these make sense as survival adaptations to a world where Ivan had proven that distributed power meant distributed vulnerability. Better to have one tyrant who might be satisfied than multiple power centers that might compete in demonstrating loyalty through cruelty. The arithmetic of autocracy that Ivan perfected contains a terrible truth. It works, not in creating prosperity or happiness or human flourishing, but in maintaining power. The calculations that treated noble families as mathematical problems to be solved created solutions that endured. Every family destroyed removed multiple potential opponents. Every wife suffering in a convent reminded 100 others of the price of resistance. Every child separated from parents became either broken victim or perfect servant of the system that broke them. This was Ivan's true legacy, more lasting than any monument or chronicle. He had proven that autocracy was not just sustainable, but self-reinforcing when pursued with sufficient mathematical rigor, that human nature itself could be re-engineered through systematic application of trauma, that the family, the basic unit of human organization since the species began, could be transformed from source of strength into mechanism of control. The question that haunted Russia for centuries after Ivan's death was whether any alternative remained possible. Could a society that had been taught so thoroughly that power meant the ability to destroy everything meaningful ever learn to organize itself differently? Could families that had internalized their own vulnerability ever again serve as foundations for resistance to tyranny? Could the human connections that make life worth living be trusted when they had been so systematically weaponized? Different Russian rulers would answer these questions differently. Some would attempt liberal reforms, only to discover that loosening control created chaos in a society that had lost the habits of self-organization. Others would return to Ivan's methods, finding them as effective in the 20th century as they had been in the 16th. The pendulum would swing between reform and reaction, but always within boundaries Ivan had established. The final accounting of Ivan the Terrible's legacy cannot be reduced to body counts or biographical details. His true monument was a transformation in how power could operate, a proof of concept that autocracy taken to its logical extreme could sustain itself through the systematic destruction of human bonds. He had asked whether there were any limits to what sovereignty could do to its subjects, and answered definitively that there were none. This answer would echo through Russian history like a curse passed from generation to generation. Every ruler who followed would know what was possible. Every subject would understand their vulnerability. The space between state and family that exists in societies with limited government had been eliminated, leaving only naked power and atomized individuals. The architecture of autocracy, built from human suffering and refined through bureaucratic precision, would outlast any Tsar or party secretary or president who inherited it. In 1584, Ivan died in his bed, chess pieces scattered around him from a game he would never finish. But the game he had mastered, the one played with human lives and calculated in generational trauma, continued without him. The rules he had written in blood and suffering would govern Russia long after his body had turned to dust. The true measure of a tyrant's success lies not in what they destroy, but in what becomes impossible after them. Ivan had made impossible the very idea that families could exist independent of state power, that human connections could resist political calculation, that love could triumph over terror. In this perverse achievement, he had no equals in history. His ghost didn't haunt Russia. It became Russia, shaping every institution and relationship with the logic of absolute power absolutely applied. The autocrat's blueprint he had drawn would be consulted by future rulers facing their own moments of crisis, finding in its terrible clarity the justification for any atrocity that served state power. The lesson was simple and eternal. In a world where everything human could be weaponized, the only safety lay in having no human connections at all. But since such existence was impossible, everyone remained vulnerable. Everyone remained controllable. Everyone remained potential victim of a system that recognized no boundary between public and private life. This was efficiency. This was governance. This was the gift Ivan the Terrible gave to history.